Hey guys, tonight setting the scene in Victorian England, 1888, the joy and solemnity of December 25th. The silence of December 25th, 1888 settled over the city of Bath, a heavy, pristine blanket of quietude rarely experienced outside of deep night. Yet this was the silence of anticipation, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic tolling of the Abbey bells announcing the arrival of Christmas Day. Inside the terraced home of the Ashworth family, a quiet revolution was stirring. Mr. Elias Ashworth, a successful solicitor, had decreed that on Christmas morning no servant was to be roused before the masters had descended. It was a day for the hearth, and in his parlor the fire was already doing its patient, democratic work. At precisely 6 a.m., the first sign of life came not from the ground floor, but from above. A faint thump-thump from the upper landing signaled the eager, barefoot descent of 9-year-old Thomas, a boy whose internal clock was synchronized to the arrival of Father Christmas. He carried a sputtering candle, his face a portrait of serious endeavor as he navigated the dark, cold staircase. Thomas reached the parlor door, taking a deep, fortifying breath of the frosty air that crept under the jamb. The room was dark, save for the glimmer of the dying embers. He pushed the door open, his small gasp echoing softly in the cavernous space. The hearth was indeed awake. A great fire had been laid the previous night, banked and layered with careful intention. A single poker nudge from Thomas was all it took. The dry kindling crackled, catching the last sparks of the wood below, and a cheerful, sudden burst of flame sprang up, licking greedily at the fresh logs. The light, soft, orange, and alive, immediately transformed the room. It fell first on the Christmas tree, not the grand, electric-lit marvels of the next century, but a dense, fragrant fir tree brought down from the Mendip Hills. It was adorned simply. Bright red ribbon bows, chains of popcorn and cranberries, and a dozen small white candles clipped to the tips of the branches, waiting for the evening illumination. But Thomas's eyes were fixed on the hearth itself. Arranged beneath the mantel, nestled amongst swags of dark, glossy holly, were the stockings. His own, knitted by his mother, lay plump and inviting, a distinct bulge near the toe hinting at the bounty within. He knelt, not yet daring to touch, inhaling the rich scent of pine and smoke. Upstairs, Mrs. Charlotte Ashworth, a woman of quiet fortitude and keen observation, heard the unmistakable sounds of the fire's awakening. She smiled into the darkness. Elias was still deep in his pillow, his barrister's mind finally at rest. Charlotte rose, shivering slightly as her feet met the cold floorboards. She dressed quickly in a thick dressing gown, her movements graceful and practiced. She took a small silver tray carrying 2 cups of steaming hot spiced cider, a family tradition to ward off the morning chill. When she entered the parlor, Thomas looked up, his face illuminated by the dancing firelight, his eyes wide with undiluted joy. "You beat me to it, my champion," Charlotte whispered, setting the tray down on the mahogany table. "But you woke the hearth splendidly." "It's the best morning, Mama," Thomas said, his voice husky with excitement. He had not touched his stocking, adhering to the unwritten rule of the house. The opening of the stockings must be observed by all. Charlotte sank into the great wing-backed armchair by the fire, its velvet upholstery worn smooth by years of use. She watched her son, her heart swelling with the specific, poignant love that only a mother on Christmas Day could know. The parlor, now warmed and filled with the scent of wood smoke, spice, and dry pine needles, was the heart of the home. This room on this day symbolized the Ashworths' prosperity and their piety. Everything was solid, enduring, and meticulously prepared. The mahogany gleamed, the heavy velvet drapes were drawn back to reveal the gray, wintry light, and the silence had evolved from anticipation into a solemn peace. A louder stirring came next, a deep, satisfied groan. Elias Ashworth, emerging from his room and descending the stairs with the gravitas of a man of law, was now joining them. Elias was a figure of Victorian respectability, sturdy, bearded, and usually consumed by the anxieties of his practice. Today, however, his face was softer. He wore a heavy wool coat over his nightclothes, a rare and indulgent concession to informality. "Good morning, my dear boy," Elias said, his voice rumbling like the deep bass notes of the Abbey bells. He paused by the tree, laying a gentle, possessive hand on the rough bark. "A magnificent tree, Thomas. Did you remember its lesson?" Thomas nodded, eyes wide. "It is the life that endures, even in the deepest winter." Elias smiled, the approval in his eyes meaning more to Thomas than any toy. He took a cider from the tray and turned towards the fireplace, the true anchor of the room. He did not simply stand before it, he attended to it. He knelt, placing another stout log onto the now roaring blaze, confirming the fire's dominance and symbolizing the sustenance of the home. The solemnity of the morning was a crucial part of the Ashworth Christmas. Before the giddy tear openings and the noisy breakfast, there was always a moment of quiet reflection centered on the reason for the day. "The darkness is past," Elias stated, looking not at his wife or son, but into the flames. "The light has come into the world. Let us remember the humility of that beginning." This was the Ashworth Christmas ritual. It was not overtly pious in the manner of a service, but it was deeply reverent. It recognized the cold, the darkness, and the fear that the Holy Family must have faced, making the sudden warmth of the hearth a metaphor for divine comfort. "The shepherds watched in the fields," Charlotte added softly, rising and going to the window, pulling the curtains wider still. The weak sunlight spilled onto the floor. They were the first to see the glory, not kings, but working men. Thomas stood between them, holding his stocking like a sacred object. He understood the ritual. The anticipation was not just about the contents of the sock, it was about the permission to finally rejoice, granted only after the initial necessary quietude. Finally, Elias clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and sudden. "Now, if the spiritual duties are fulfilled, then let us attend to the earthly ones." The dam of anticipation broke. Thomas tore into his stocking with a ferocity that was almost painful to watch. The contents were predictable, yet cherished. An orange, a spectacular luxury, a small lead soldier, a handful of hard candies, and best of all, a copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a grown-up book that meant he was truly crossing the threshold into young manhood. As Thomas plunged into the world of his new gifts, Charlotte and Elias exchanged a look of pure, shared contentment. They did not immediately open their own smaller, more symbolic gifts that sat wrapped on the mantel, a new shawl for Charlotte, a leather-bound journal for Elias. Their gift was this scene, this piece. The final element of the morning arrived 10 minutes later with a joyful clatter. Miss Eleanor Ashworth, 17, and her younger brother Samuel, 14, tumbled down the stairs. Eleanor, wrapped in a bright tarlin shawl, was beautiful and dramatic, a whirlwind of energy. Samuel, taller than his father but still gangly, was quieter, his eyes already fixed on the breakfast table. "Oh, Thomas, you always get the best things first," Eleanor exclaimed, though she was immediately mollified by the sight of her own stocking, which contained gloves and a ribbon. She immediately set about arranging her ribbon in the mirror over the mantel, oblivious to the history of the house. But Samuel paused. He saw his parents, satisfied and calm by the fire. He saw Thomas, lost in his book. He took a moment, absorbing the warmth, the heavy, contented atmosphere, and the solemnity of the scene that had just transpired. He was old enough to know that this feeling, this perfect, momentary peace, was not an accident. It was something his parents created every year. He walked over to the fire and, like his father before him, knelt. He did not touch the logs or the poker. He simply extended his hands to the heat, feeling the radiant, life-giving warmth flood his chilled fingers. He looked at his father. "Happy Christmas, Papa," he said, his voice earnest. Elias clapped his son on the shoulder, a heavy, sincere gesture. "Happy Christmas, my boy. The hearth has awakened, and so have we all. Let the great day begin." The family was complete.
The parlor was full of light, sound, and the rich, complex scent of the season. The solemnity of the morning had successfully transitioned into the joy of the holiday. The Ashworth Christmas had officially begun.
Focusing on themes of charity, service, and generosity toward the less fortunate. The delicate peace of Christmas Day had dissolved into the blustering, invigorating activity of December 26th. In Victorian England, this day, traditionally known as St. Stephen's Day, or more commonly Boxing Day, was dedicated less to feasting and more to giving. It was a day when the affluent addressed the moral responsibility of their prosperity by offering gifts, money, and leftover food from their abundant tables to those in service and those in need. For the Ashworth family, Boxing Day was a practical, necessary antidote to the luxurious indulgence of the day prior. It was a firm lesson in service, particularly for the children. At 8 a.m., the house was a flurry of organized domestic chaos. Mrs. Charlotte Ashworth, having already presented the servants with their Christmas box, a small payment and a few days' holiday, was now directing the transformation of the dining room. Leftover roast turkey, plum pudding, and vast quantities of sliced ham were being carefully wrapped and stacked. "Eleanor, the soup must be thick enough to hold a spoon upright," instructed her 17-year-old daughter. "Winter soup is no good if it is thin. Elias, are the coals banked sufficiently for the wagon journey?" Elias Ashworth, the solicitor, was out in the mews, overseeing the preparation of the family's sturdy open wagon. Unlike the smooth, covered carriage they used for professional calls, this wagon was rugged, loaded with blankets, coal, and the heavy boxes of food. "It is banked, Charlotte," Elias called back, pulling on thick gloves. "But the air is biting. I expect the River Avon is nearly frozen solid this morning." The Ashworths did not merely send their donations, they delivered them. This was Charlotte's firm belief. Charity must be personal. They did not go to the formal workhouses, which were often governed by cold bureaucracy. Instead, they focused on a specific struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of Bath, near the crumbling remains of the old wool mills. The younger children, Thomas, 9, and Samuel, 14, were bundled in layers of wool and tweed, their excitement tempered by the solemnity of the task. They were not delivering toys, they were delivering sustenance. "Thomas, you must hold this ladle steady," Samuel instructed, puffing steam into the cold air. Samuel, feeling grown up since receiving his new pocket watch yesterday, was responsible for the great iron pot of thick lentil and vegetable soup that sat carefully secured in the wagon. "Why is it called Boxing Day?" Thomas asked, struggling with the ladle. Elias, checking the harness, answered without looking up. "Because of the boxes, Thomas. The old tradition was that priests would open the alms box on St. Stephen's Day and distribute the contents. More recently, tradesmen and servants carried small boxes to the houses they served, expecting a small gift of money or goods. We are simply inverting the custom today. We are bringing the boxes to those who cannot ask for them." This explanation underscored the central theme, reciprocity and obligation. The Ashworths, having received God's bounty, were obligated to share it. By 9:30 a.m., the wagon was ready. Elias drove, Charlotte sat beside him, Eleanor and Samuel sat behind, guarding the precious load, and Thomas squeezed in beside the driver, clutching a small leather-bound purse of coins Elias had given him for distribution. The journey took them away from the elegant Georgian crescents of Bath, past the Royal Victoria Park, and into the grim reality of the city's underbelly. The air grew heavier, filled not with wood smoke and spice, but with the sharp smell of coal dust and damp masonry. They pulled the wagon into the center of a narrow, cobbled lane, lined with cramped, soot-stained cottages. The windows were small, the chimneys smoking sluggishly. Here, the quiet of the morning was not of peace, but of cold exhaustion. The moment the Ashworth wagon stopped, a silent shift occurred.
Doors creaked open, and faces, pale, etched with worry, appeared. The poverty was stark, but so too was the immediate sense of community and humility. There was no clamor, only a quiet, hopeful approach. Charlotte took charge, her demeanor firm yet profoundly gentle. She addressed a woman whose shawl was thin and whose children were huddled close to her skirts. "Mrs. Oakhaven, happy St. Stephen's Day. We have food for you and yours." The work was immediate and relentless. Eleanor and Samuel were tasked with distributing the coal and blankets, the tangible warmth that would last longer than the meal. Eleanor, usually focused on balls and fashions, was startled by the raw coldness of the hands that reached for the thick blankets. She met the eyes of an old man whose gaze held a mixture of gratitude and weary pride. For the first time, she truly saw the life of hardship beyond her own cullished world. The sheer scale of the need humbled her theatrical nature. Meanwhile, Elias and Thomas distributed the food and coin. Thomas, ladle in hand, was responsible for serving the soup. His small hand trembled as he carefully poured the thick, steaming liquid into chipped earthenware bowls brought forth by the residents. He looked up at a young boy, perhaps his own age, whose clothes were patched and whose cheek was smudged with dirt. "Here," Thomas whispered, ensuring the bowl was full. The boy did not smile, but his eyes conveyed a depth of gratitude that struck Thomas to his core. Yesterday's lead soldier felt meaningless. The warmth in the bowl, the necessity of it, was a lesson in true value. Elias, moving with efficiency, spoke to the men of the community. He asked about their trades, their wives, and the health of their children. He wasn't just handing out money, he was offering dignity and acknowledging their worth. "Mr. Davies," Elias said, pressing a few shillings into the calloused hand of a former stone mason, "I have some legal work, simple documentation that requires a man with steady penmanship. If you are willing, come to my office on the 28th. I shall pay fairly." This was Elias's particular form of charity, the offer of work. He understood that genuine relief came not just from a handout, but from the restoration of independence. He aimed not just to fill stomachs, but to revive spirits. Around noon, the Ashworths paused for a moment of quiet reflection, sitting on the edge of the wagon. The food and coal were nearly gone. The children of the street, who had been timid at first, now stood a respectful distance away, their faces showing the first signs of warmth and contentment. Charlotte looked at Eleanor, whose bright cheeks were wind-chapped, but whose eyes were clear and sober. "Do you see, my dear?" Charlotte murmured. Eleanor nodded, pulling her tartan shawl tighter. "It is not simply that they have less food, Mama. It is the cold, the way the cold sinks into everything. We forget inside our heavy walls." This realization, the physical feeling of poverty, was a crucial development for Eleanor. It added a layer of depth to her character that the frivolous pursuits of Christmas Day could not provide. Samuel, having finished distributing the last of the blankets, was now speaking to the young boy Thomas had served earlier. The boy's name was Michael. Michael was holding his bowl, occasionally blowing on the soup. Samuel, the quiet middle child, was usually awkward in conversation, but here, in the cold, he found an unexpected ease. "What is your favorite story?" Samuel asked. Michael looked up, surprised by the question. "Stories? My dad tells me stories of the sea, when he was a boy, before the mills came." Samuel, who loved to read adventure novels, found a connection. He began to recount in simple terms the plot of Treasure Island, which he had devoured weeks ago. The shared moment was not charity, it was friendship. As the sun began its swift descent, painting the gray sky with streaks of bruised purple, the Ashworths prepared to leave. The remaining residents came forward, not with loud thanks, but with quiet, profound blessings. Elias looked at his family, his weary, wind-beaten wife, his thoughtful older children, and his small, serious boy. They had given not just of their abundance, but of their time and comfort. They had faced the hardship of others, and in doing so had found a deeper appreciation for their own home. "The feast of Stephen is over," Elias said, climbing back onto the driver's seat. "Let us return to the warmth we have earned." As the wagon rattled back towards the city center, the contrast was striking. They were leaving the quiet desperation of the mills and returning to the humming prosperity of Bath. But the Ashworths were not the same. Thomas kept his small, empty ladle in his lap, the remnants of lentil soup clinging to the silver. Eleanor's face was still marked by the seriousness of the old man's gaze. They had done their duty, fulfilled their moral contract, and in doing so had deepened their own understanding of Christmastide. The warmth of their hearth would feel all the more precious tonight, purchased not with gold, but the cold effort of generosity.
Introducing the central characters and their personal commitments or conflicts that must be resolved during the holiday. The evening of December 26th settled over the Ashworth home with a deceptive tranquility. The moral labor of the day had left the family physically tired but emotionally cleansed. The fire in the parlor was subdued, giving off a steady, comforting heat, and the scent of pine and leftover spiced cider lingered in the air. Yet underneath the veneer of contentment, deep, unspoken anxieties began to stir, each member of the family carrying a private burden, a vow made or a truth suppressed that the solemnity of the holiday season forced into painful clarity. 1. The vow of Elias, justice versus mercy. Elias Ashworth, the solicitor, sat alone in his study, the heavy oak door closed against the soft murmur of the house. He was not resting. His hand rested on a legal file, thin but weighty enough to crush a life. The file concerned the imminent closure of a small, family-owned printing press in Bath, a legacy business owned by Mr. Herbert Ponsonby. Ponsonby owed a considerable sum to Elias's primary and most powerful client, Sir Alister Finch. The legal position was irrefutable. Ponsonby was insolvent, and Finch demanded foreclosure immediately after the New Year. Elias, the efficient instrument of the law, was poised to deliver the final blow. However, during the charity rounds today, Elias had seen Mr. Ponsonby. Not on the street, but standing outside the window of his own empty shop, his face etched with a desperate, hollow exhaustion that Elias instantly recognized as the precursor to ruin. Ponsonby hadn't begged, he had simply stood there, a ghost of the man who had once printed Elias's wedding invitations. Elias had made an unspoken vow to himself years ago to uphold the law with absolute integrity, ensuring justice was served even when it lacked mercy. But now the weight of the vow felt crushing. Ponsonby's destitution, seen so clearly on St. Stephen's Day, contradicted the very spirit of the season Elias had preached. He poured himself a small glass of sherry, his mind racing. His commitment to Finch, his client, the pillar of his own success, was professional, but his commitment to the true meaning of Christmastide was moral. Can a man of law stand by and watch a good man be destroyed by a cold contract? Elias vowed that before Epiphany he would find a way, a legal loophole, a persuasive argument to grant Ponsonby a reprieve, even if it meant jeopardizing his standing with Sir Alister. His personal integrity was at war with his professional duty, and the resolution of this internal conflict was his Christmastide quest. 2. The vow of Charlotte, truth versus protection. Upstairs, Charlotte Ashworth was performing her nightly ritual of checking on her sleeping children. As she tucked the blankets tighter around Thomas, her gaze fell upon a small, faded locket tucked into her dressing table drawer, a piece of jewelry she hadn't worn in years. Charlotte's vow was one of protection. 16 years ago, before her marriage to Elias, she had sheltered a secret, a circumstance involving a close family member's scandalous flight from England.
She had promised to guard this information, knowing its revelation would not only damage her own impeccable reputation, but could also destabilize Elias's career and, most importantly, bring shame upon her children, particularly her eldest, Eleanor. The immediate tension centered on a letter she had received from London just 2 days before Christmas. The letter was from an old acquaintance, casually mentioning the impending return of the person whose secret she guarded. Charlotte knew that her silent protection was now active concealment. If this person returned, the truth would be revealed, not by her, but by circumstance, and the shock would be devastating. Her vow to protect her family had suddenly collided with a deeper moral imperative. Can one build a life of truth and piety on a foundation of silence? Her internal conflict was agonizing. She looked at the locket, a symbol of the vow she had kept for so long. She resolved that before the 12th night party, she would have to decide whether to break her old vow of silence and reveal the truth herself, managing the fallout, or continue the deception, risking total ruin. Her peace of mind, the very serenity she projected, depended on the outcome. 3. Eleanor's vow: passion versus propriety. In the shared bedroom, Eleanor, usually so spirited and focused on social triumph, was staring at her reflection with unusual seriousness. Her conflict was one of the heart, a crisis of propriety. Eleanor was secretly, passionately devoted to Mr. Richard Thorne, a young architect whose family was respected but lacked the deep, dependable wealth Elias Ashworth expected of his future son-in-law. Elias had been subtly but firmly guiding Eleanor toward a match with Mr. Arthur Davies, wealthy, dull, and utterly respectable. Eleanor's personal vow was twofold. She would never marry a man she did not love, and, further, she would make Richard understand the depth of her feeling before the engagement to Arthur was finalized. The crucial point was the planned New Year's Eve assembly. Arthur was expected to make a formal presentation to Elias that night, effectively sealing the engagement. This gave Eleanor only 5 days to act. Today, witnessing the poverty and desperation during their charity work had sharpened her focus. The contrast between the cold reality outside and the frivolous pursuit of a loveless, purely financial marriage inside struck her as morally repugnant. She saw now that true worth was not in wealth, but in character, the very character she saw in Richard Thorne. Eleanor vowed to secure a private meeting with Richard before New Year's Eve to declare her intentions and implore him to fight for her, a bold and potentially scandalous move that risked her reputation and her father's wrath. This act of romantic rebellion was her central conflict, a struggle between the suffocating expectations of Victorian society and the demands of her own beating heart. Identity versus expectation. Samuel Ashworth, 14, the quiet middle child, was standing on the precipice of manhood, and his conflict was of identity. Elias expected Samuel to follow him into law, to become the next generation of Ashworth's solicitor. He had already purchased books on legal history for Samuel's Christmas gift, clear markers of his expectation. Samuel, however, felt a deep, profound calling not to law, but to the sea. Today, during the carriage ride, listening to Michael speak of his father's sailing days, that longing had become overwhelming. He loved the rough, tangible world of shipbuilding and navigation, not the dry, dusty world of contracts. He spent hours sketching complex rigging and hull designs in a hidden notebook. His vow was simple, yet terrifying. He would tell his father the truth about his vocational passion. He had resolved that before the end of Christmastide, he would gather the courage to present his hidden notebook to Elias. Samuel knew this truth would cause immense disappointment, perhaps even anger, for he would be rejecting the path laid out for him. The weight of the vow was the weight of his father's immense expectation. He looked at the unread legal textbooks on his shelf, then at the rough sketches of a three-masted schooner tucked under his mattress. He realized that this holiday was not about enjoying a respite, it was about defining himself, regardless of the cost.
Thomas's vow: imagination versus reality. Even 9-year-old Thomas, sheltered as he was, carried a weight. His was a vow of imagination. Today, seeing the real boy Michael and the real cold, Thomas felt a profound dissatisfaction with the fictional heroes in his Sherlock Holmes book. The fictional battles seemed meaningless compared to the real struggle for a bowl of soup. His small, secret vow: he would find Michael again before the holiday ended and give him something real, something that truly mattered, not just a fleeting gift. He had one possession he truly cherished, a small, intricate wooden carving of a sailing ship, a family heirloom that sat on his bedside table. It was his most prized possession. Thomas knew that giving away his favorite thing would test his spirit in a way that reading about a hero never could. His conflict was between the safety of his sheltered world and the courage to make a true sacrifice. The house, therefore, was not a place of peaceful slumber. It was a crucible. Elias, Charlotte, Eleanor, and Samuel each carried a vow that represented a potential rupture in the family's harmonious facade. The remaining days of Christmastide, the days leading up to the 12th night climax, would be the stage upon which these private conflicts were fought, the weight of their respective vows demanding resolution before the traditional end of the holiday, the dawning of Epiphany, and the return to the cold, unforgiving reality of the new year. Exploring the tradition of traveling players, drama, and the blending of sacred and secular festivity. December 27th, St. John the Evangelist's Day, was traditionally a day of quiet contemplation, but the evening brought a customary, boisterous disruption to the solemnity of Christmastide, the Mummers' Play. The mummers, or traveling performers, were an ancient tradition that blended folk ritual with religious narrative, often incorporating slapstick, satire, and the central theme of death and resurrection. They acted as a joyous, chaotic bridge between the sacred core of Christmas and the secular revelry of the New Year. At the Ashworth home, the event was a grand affair designed by Charlotte to entertain neighbors and underscore their family's commitment to preserving English heritage. The parlor had been cleared of its heavy furniture, transforming the room into a rough theater. A line of chairs provided seating, and the gas lamps were turned low to emphasize the firelight. Eleanor, draped in a fashionable velvet gown, was in a state of nervous energy. The mummers' performance was the perfect opportunity to subtly orchestrate her meeting with Richard Forne, the young architect, who she knew would be attending the event with his family. The crowded, distracted atmosphere would be her shield. The entrance of the players. The arrival of the mummers was heralded by a great cheer from the street and a decisive, rhythmic knocking on the front door. Elias, his professional dignity slightly relaxed by the festive mood, swung the door open. Standing on the threshold were 6 men, masked or with faces blackened, wearing elaborate, tattered costumes adorned with ribbons, bits of lace, and animal skins. They carried wooden swords and staffs. "Room, room, brave gallants, room!" boomed the director, a tall man with a voice like an old church organ. He led the players, including St. George, the dragon, the Turkish knight, and the farcical doctor, into the parlor. The play began immediately, a rush of rhyming couplets, stylized sword fights, and ridiculous death scenes. The audience laughed easily at the absurdity, a welcome release from the measured control of Victorian life. The dramatic parallel. The performance, despite its silliness, acted as a mirror for the Ashworths' internal conflicts. For Elias, justice versus mercy, Elias watched the combat between St. George and the Turkish knight.
The fight was governed by strict rules, but the ultimate resolution, the inevitable death of the knight, was a purely legalistic outcome. Then the grotesque doctor arrived, claiming to cure all ills, even death, with his ridiculous potions. Elias realized his professional conflict was exactly this. He was the unyielding law, St. George, but he desperately needed the impossible cure, the doctor's mercy, to save Mr. Ponsonby's printing press. The public farce amplified his private dilemma. For Samuel, identity versus expectation, Samuel, seated quietly, was drawn to the technical skill of the players. He observed the stagecraft, the crude costumes, and the way the performers commanded the space. His gaze fell upon the man playing the sailor, a minor character who briefly appeared to fight alongside St. George. The sailor wore a simple, rough shirt, and his movements were confident and free. Samuel felt a wrenching envy. The mummers, in their temporary transformation, demonstrated the power of discarding one's expected role. If they can be someone else for a night, why can't I be a sailor for a lifetime? The spectacle fueled his resolve to present his sketches to his father. Eleanor's bold move. This was Eleanor's moment. She spotted Richard Thorne standing near the mantelpiece, captivated by the action. He was a striking contrast to the other guests. His clothes were less ostentatious, and his attention was fixed on the artistic merit of the performance, not the social spectacle. As the central, noisy fight scene between St. George and the dragon reached its loudest peak, Eleanor acted. The noise was perfect cover. She glided through the seated guests, stopping beside Richard. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice breathy but clear, the urgency overcoming her inerrant shyness. Richard turned, his eyes widening in surprise and immediate delight. "Miss Ashworth, a truly spirited performance, is it not?" "It is," she agreed, leaning close so their conversation remained private. "But I cannot think of dragons. I must speak to you of the real battle, the one concerning my future." She glanced toward her mother, Charlotte, who was watching the play with a keen, proprietorial eye. "I was hoping to see you. I wished to ask if you have considered the commission I spoke of, the design for the new town hall wing," Richard asked, believing she was talking about a professional matter. Eleanor cut straight to the core of her vow. "Richard, I do not speak of commissions. I speak of my father's expectation. Arthur Davis will call upon my father on New Year's Eve. He will speak of marriage. If I allow this, I will be bound." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Richard's face, which had been open and eager, hardened with shock. "Bound," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But I was certain you understood my feeling for you." "I understand it perfectly, as you must understand mine. But understanding is not enough. You must act. You must make your intentions clear to my father, and you must do it before the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve. Do not speak of town halls. Speak of me." This was the complete fulfillment of her vow, forcing Richard to move beyond vague admiration and commit to a tangible, public challenge to her father's authority. She risked everything, her reputation hanging on his reply. Richard looked from Eleanor's beautiful, desperate face back to the mummers on the floor, who were now noisily resurrecting the fallen knight. He saw the risk, the scandal, and the incredible challenge this demanded. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice now firm, "I am not a wealthy man, but I am a man of honor. If you give me until the 30th to find the right words, I shall speak to your father. I will not lose you to a contract." Eleanor let out a silent, shaky breath of triumph and terror. Her vow had been discharged, and the crisis now belonged to the men. The shadow of the past. Meanwhile, Charlotte observed the entire scene with agonizing clarity. She hadn't heard the words, but she had seen the intense private exchange between Eleanor and Richard.
Her daughter's rebellious heart was now set on a collision course with Elias's plans. But the mummer's performance brought forth a more immediate threat to Charlotte's vow of protection. The final member of the troupe was the fool, wearing a coxcomb and a mask, dancing wildly and collecting coins. As the fool passed by Charlotte, he paused, his masked gaze seeming to lock on her face. He did not speak, but he performed a small, personalized gesture, a sharp, distinct tug on his own left earlobe. It was an arcane, trivial gesture that Charlotte recognized instantly, a childhood signal shared only with one person, the family member whose scandalous history she had suppressed for 16 years. The gesture was a message, "I am here." Charlotte's blood ran cold. The fool's identity was masked by the costume, but she was now certain the person whose secret she had guarded, the person mentioned in the letter, was not just in Bath. They were in her parlor, disguised as a traveling player, an uninvited, dramatic presence in her
The sudden, chaotic blending of sacred drama and personal crisis was complete. The Mummers play had not merely entertained, it had initiated the final, irrevocable clash of the Ashworth family's private vows and external realities, propelling the story toward the inevitable reckoning of Twelfth Night. December 28th, Holy Innocents' Day. A somber, reflective section dealing with memory, loss, and the importance of protection. December 28th, known as Holy Innocents' Day or Childermas, was the coldest, darkest day of Christmastide. It commemorates the children murdered by King Herod in his desperate attempt to destroy the infant Christ. In Victorian tradition, the day was marked by quiet reflection, often involving a visit to the graveyard, a moment of silence for lost kin, and a renewed commitment to the protection of children. The frivolity of the previous evening, the Mummers play, felt distant and almost inappropriate. A heavy, relentless drizzle replaced the previous day's festive atmosphere, clinging to the windows of the Ashworth home like a shroud. Charlotte's Vigil. Charlotte Ashworth felt the somber weight of the day most acutely. She had slept little, haunted by the image of the masked fool and the agonizing certainty of his identity. The individual whose scandalous past she had vowed to conceal for 16 years was her younger sister Clara, who had fled England years ago after an indiscretion that would have ruined the entire family. Charlotte stood by the parlor window, the very window the Mummers had peered into. She did not look out at the rain. She looked inward, into the past. She was tormented by her original vow of protection. She hadn't protected Clara from scandal. She had protected her family from the truth of Clara's shame. The cold glass of the window pane reflected her strained face. She realized the true danger. Clara's impulsive, dramatic appearance as a mummer's fool meant she was desperate and perhaps reckless. The risk to Elias's career and Eleanor's potential match with Arthur Davies, the respectable match Elias desired, was now immediate. If Clara was discovered, the shame would be indelible. Clara thought about the meaning of Holy Innocents' Day, the necessity of sanctuary, and the desperation of the flight to Egypt. She recognized that her quiet, elegant home was a kind of sanctuary, and that Clara, impulsive, dramatic, and currently disguised, was seeking protection. The greatest act of protection is often the riskiest act of love, Clara concluded. She resolved to find Clara before anyone else did, offer her whatever help she needed, and somehow mitigate the catastrophic revelation. This meant breaking her old vow of silence, but only after she had secured Clara's safety. She quietly took a single white beeswax candle from the mantelpiece, a symbol of purity and memory, and placed it on the dining room windowsill, the traditional gesture on Childermas. It was a silent, private beacon, a signal of welcome and safety, a small light against the dark, judgmental world outside. The burden of Elias's choice.
Elias also felt the weight of the day, which deepened his conflict, justice versus mercy. He had chosen to spend the morning in the cemetery, visiting the grave of his own father, a stern but fair man who had instilled in Elias the absolute worship of legal precedent. Standing in the chill, damp air, he found himself reflecting on the definition of a good solicitor. His father had taught him that a good man follows the law, even if it brings personal cost. But today, the memory of Mr. Ponsonby, the ruined printer, was a heavier presence than the memory of his own father. "Father," Elias muttered, addressing the mossy headstone, "you taught me that justice is blind, but what if blindness leads to cruelty?" Elias carried with him the necessary papers to initiate the final foreclosure on Ponsonby's shop, but his hand refused to sign the final authorization. Holy Innocents' Day, with its focus on vulnerability, had convinced him that the destruction of a decent man's legacy solely to increase his wealthy client's quarterly dividend was a violation of the Christmas spirit. He made a second, definitive vow. He would meet with Sir Alistair Finch on the 30th and personally advocate for a 3-month reprieve for Ponsonby, offering to cover any immediate legal penalty himself. This decision would cost him dearly, in reputation, in future fees, and possibly in a permanent break with his most important client. But the peace of mind offered by this difficult choice felt like the only true gift he could give himself this Christmastide. His act of protection was one of professional sacrifice. Thomas's quiet sacrifice. Thomas, the youngest, was unusually quiet. He understood that Holy Innocents' Day was about sorrow for children who had suffered. His mind went immediately to Michael, the boy he had served soup for on Boxing Day. He sat cross-legged by the hearth, meticulously polishing his treasured wooden ship carving, the one he had vowed to give to Michael. The carving was small, intricate, and deeply sentimental, having been a gift from his seafaring grandfather. He knew that if he gave it away, the gift would be permanent. He would lose his most prized link to his grandfather, yet he felt an undeniable pull towards the sacrifice. The memory of Michael's patched clothes and quiet gratitude was stronger than the possessiveness of the heirloom. He wrapped the ship in a piece of soft velvet cloth, tying it with a simple piece of string. This was his own solemn, private ceremony. It was not a gesture of charity dictated by his parents. It was an act of love derived from his own understanding of the holiday's true meaning, giving until it hurts. He now only needed the courage to execute his vow. Eleanor and Samuel, the weight of risk. Eleanor and Samuel spent the afternoon in the drawing room, reading, but neither could concentrate. They were each preoccupied with the immense risks they had taken. Eleanor, passion versus propriety, was exhilarated and terrified by her decisive action with Richard Thorne. She had set the clock ticking. Her mind kept returning to the moment the doctor in the Mummers play had resurrected the dead knight. She had brought her dormant romance back to life, but now she was utterly exposed to its potentially fatal consequences, a scandal that would ruin her reputation if Richard failed to win Elias's consent. Samuel, identity versus expectation, felt a rising surge of panic. He had been inspired by the Mummers' freedom, but his resolve to show his father his sketches was dissolving under the weight of his father's immense, quiet expectation. He looked at his father's study door, closed and impenetrable. How can I ask him to give up his dream for my own reckless fancy? The fear of his father's disapproval felt more real and more immediate than the love of the sea. In the midst of the gloomy reflection, Charlotte entered the drawing room. She walked straight to the window where she had placed the candle. "Eleanor, Samuel," Charlotte said quietly, her voice imbued with a rare, deep seriousness. "Today is about memory and the importance of keeping safe what is vulnerable." She gestured toward the candle. "When you see that light, remember that every safe home is a sanctuary. Every one of us at some point needs protection from the harshness of the world. It is our greatest duty to offer it, even if the offering puts us at risk. Her words, aimed specifically to the unseen Clara, struck Eleanor and Samuel with unexpected force. They took her words personally, interpreting them as a profound affirmation of their own vulnerable, risky vows. Eleanor felt the sanction to fight for her passionate love. Samuel felt the courage to reveal his true, vulnerable passion for the sea. The candle, meant as a signal of sanctuary for a secret sister, became a symbol of moral courage for the children. As the dusk gathered and the drizzle intensified, the solitary candle in the window of the Ashworth home glowed steadily. It was a beacon against the cold, a quiet vow that no matter the cost, they would protect their deepest commitments to justice, to love, to family, and to the vulnerable truth within themselves. The somber reflection of Holy Innocents' Day had hardened their resolve, preparing them for the public, volatile events to come.
The arrival of extended family or community members bringing new tension and opportunities for reconciliation. December 29th arrived, marking the true high tide of Christmastide social calls. With New Year's Eve, the evening Elias had slated for Arthur Davies' formal proposal just around the corner, the Ashworth home became a nexus for extended family and key community members. This gathering, designed to demonstrate the family's stability and prosperity, instead acted as a volatile catalyst, forcing long-held resentments and secret vows into the open. The arrival of Aunt Honoria and Arthur Davies. The first to arrive were Aunt Honoria Finch Smythe and her formidable, if slightly fussy, husband, Uncle Reginald. Honoria was Elias's widowed sister, a woman whose every word was governed by the rigid dictates of Bath society. She was particularly close to Sir Alistair Finch, Elias's demanding client, a connection that made Elias acutely aware of the risk his vow to protect Mr. Ponsonby entailed. With them arrived the man of the hour, Mr. Arthur Davies. Arthur was a model of conventional success. He was wealthy, had inherited land, and his manners were impeccable. He represented everything Elias believed a husband for Eleanor should be: safe, predictable, and financially sound. The parlor, now filled with the rustling silk of Honoria's gown and the faint scent of Arthur's expensive cologne, felt tighter, the air suddenly thick with obligation. "Eleanor, dear girl, you are looking positively radiant," Aunt Honoria declared, her gaze instantly assessing Eleanor's dress and demeanor. "Arthur tells me you have been entirely too busy with charity this week. Excellent, but one must not neglect one's social duties. Propriety is a greater virtue than mere kindness." This was the core tension for Eleanor: passion versus propriety. Honoria's presence was a palpable representation of societal pressure to marry well, stifling the passionate freedom Eleanor had claimed for herself with Richard Thorne. Arthur, meanwhile, focused his attention entirely on Elias. "Mr. Ashworth, I trust your client, Sir Alistair, is well. I look forward to congratulating you on the successful conclusion of that unfortunate printing house matter." Arthur's casual mention of the Ponsonby case made Elias's heart sink. It was clear that the social circles were already expecting the printer's ruin. Elias, justice versus mercy, realized his attempt to secure mercy for Ponsonby would not only disappoint a powerful client, but would also cause public speculation and potentially damage his reputation for professional ruthlessness. The presence of his sister, a direct link to Finch, intensified the cost of his vow. Charlotte's desperate search. While Elias navigated the legal currents, Charlotte, truth versus protection, was conducting a tense, silent operation. Since the Mummers play, she had been discreetly inquiring about the troupe, hoping to find a lead on her sister,
Clara, the fool. She knew she had little time left before Clara, impulsive and visible, risked accidental exposure. She cornered Uncle Reginald, who, as a member of the local historical society, had contacts among the less reputable elements of the city. "Reginald, I have a historical query," Charlotte began, her voice low. "The Mummers play. I was fascinated by the character of the fool. Did you, by chance, learn the name of the man who played that role on the 27th? Reginald puffed up with self-importance. "Ah, the fool! A remarkably agile fellow. Quite odd, though. Not one of the usual Bristol players. The company hired him in the Market Square just a week prior. Said his name was... what was it? Something common. Clark? No, Clerk." "Clark," Charlotte repeated, concealing her intense relief and dread. A simple, assumed name. It was clearly a disguise, but it was a starting point. "He also requested his payment in a quite peculiar way," Reginald added, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "He insisted that half the coins be sent to a certain address, a lodging house near the old wool mills." Charlotte's internal alarm bells rang violently. The wool mills, the same neighborhood where they had conducted their Boxing Day charity. Clara was living in the starkest poverty, hiding just miles from her wealthy sister. This information provided the concrete location Charlotte needed to fulfill her vow to secure Clara. She realized she would have to slip away from the gathering that evening to find her. The collision of youthful ambitions. Meanwhile, the younger generation faced their own social pressures. Samuel, identity versus expectation, felt cornered by the arrival of the extended family. His Aunt Honoria, in particular, kept steering him toward the legal texts Elias had given him. "Samuel, your father's library is waiting for you. A fine future in the law. So solid, so respectable. You simply must put those childhood fancies aside." The pressure was suffocating. Samuel desperately looked for an escape and spotted Richard Sorn, who had arrived unannounced, determined to follow up on his own vow to Eleanor. Richard was speaking passionately to an older builder about a new architectural proposal. Samuel, drawn by Richard's commitment to his own craft, approached him. "Mr. Thorne, forgive me, but I overheard you speaking of structural integrity. I have a question about load-bearing in a ship's hull." Richard, recognizing the young boy from the previous night, immediately shifted his focus. He saw not a child, but a genuine engineering mind. For the next half hour, while Arthur Davies spoke to Elias about municipal bonds, Samuel and Richard spoke of drafts, keels, and the power of the sea. A genuine moment of professional reconciliation and mentorship. Richard, needing to prove his worth to Elias, instinctively understood that connecting with Elias's son through a shared unconventional passion might be the key to winning over the family, not just Eleanor. Thomas's quiet reconciliation. Thomas found the crowded house overwhelming. He retreated to the kitchen, where he sought out Mrs. Higgins, the cook, to beg a few leftover pieces of plum cake. He was interrupted by the appearance of the most unassuming of the guests, Mr. Ponsonby, the printer. Elias, in a quiet act of his own vow, had invited Ponsonby to a small, formal gathering as a gesture of dignity and respect before his inevitable financial fall. Ponsonby stood awkwardly by the doorway, a ghost among the revelers. Thomas, remembering the man's exhaustion outside the empty shop, walked straight up to him. He held out the small, velvet-wrapped wooden ship carving. "Sir," Thomas said simply, pushing the parcel into Ponsonby's hand, "this is for a friend. He needs it more than I do, but I want to be certain it is safe until I can give it to him." Ponsonby, utterly surprised by the trust placed in him by the child, unfolded the velvet cloth. The intricate carving of the ship was beautiful. "It is a fine piece, son," Ponsonby said, his voice husky. "It means sailing, sir," Thomas whispered, "and escaping bad weather." Ponsonby understood the metaphor perfectly. The child was entrusting him, the man facing professional death, with a symbol of hope and escape. "I shall guard it with my life," Ponsonby vowed, placing the carving carefully into his coat pocket. In that quiet exchange, Ponsonby felt a flicker of hope, not for his shop, but for his own sense of self-worth. It was a profound mutual reconciliation. Thomas's imaginative world was reconciled with the harsh reality of need, and Ponsonby's dignity was momentarily restored. The gathering, intended to project perfect Ashworth propriety, instead had brought all the family's secret conflicts to a head. Elias faced the immediate cost of his mercy. Charlotte had the location of her sister. Eleanor's love was on the verge of a public challenge, and Samuel had found a voice for his secret ambition. The weight of the impending New Year's Eve climax was now pressing down upon them all.
He delivered the verdict with chilling finality. The foreclosure proceeds on January 2nd as planned. Furthermore, Mr. Ashworth, I regret to inform you that effective immediately, my firm will be seeking representation whose priorities align more closely with their retainer. You are dismissed. Elias had won mercy for his own soul, but he had lost his most lucrative client and guaranteed the printer's ruin. The walk back to his office was the longest of his career. The cost of his vow was immense, but as he sat in his empty office, preparing his resignation to Finch, he felt a profound, albeit painful, cleansing of the past. He was no longer a slave to Finch's wealth. He was his own man, beholden only to his own conscience. Charlotte's Descent and Reconciliation, December 30th, evening. While Elias paid his professional price, Charlotte, Truth versus Protection, paid her personal one. Armed with the address provided by Reginald, she left the house under the cover of a freezing evening fog, telling Elias only that she had an urgent charitable errand. She took a hired cab to the Wool Mills district, the same bleak neighborhood they had visited on Boxing Day. The air here was even colder, the houses darker. She found the lodging house, a ramshackle building clinging to the edge of the river. She found her sister, Clara, the former mummer's fool, huddled in a tiny, bare room. Clara was thin, pale, and dressed in cheap, stained clothing. She was not the carefree, reckless girl Charlotte remembered, but a woman broken by years of wandering and hardship. "Clara," Charlotte whispered, closing the door behind her. Clara looked up, her face crumpling not with shame, but with exhaustion. "You found me. Of course you did. You always were the clever one. Did you come to tell me the price of my disgrace?" Charlotte sat beside her, taking her cold, chapped hand. "I came because of the candle in the window, Clara. I came to tell you that this house, my house, is your sanctuary." The sisters spoke for hours. Clara recounted the years of struggle, the brief, disastrous marriage, and the desperation that led her to join the mummers to earn enough to see her family again. Charlotte confessed her own silent vow, her fear of the shame that had made her complicit in Clara's isolation. It was a painful but profound reconciliation. Charlotte vowed to find a safe, permanent arrangement for Clara, far away from Bath, but one that guaranteed her security and dignity. She recognized that true protection was not hiding a secret, but building a future. She would use the rest of Christmastide to finalize her plan, ensuring the past was cleansed before New Year's Day. The Eve of Decision, December 31st. New Year's Eve began in the Ashworth home with a flurry of activity, focused on the great family dinner and the impending visit of Arthur Davies. Eleanor, passion versus propriety, was a knot of nerves. She was dressed in her finest gown, preparing for the formal dinner where Arthur was expected to make his intentions known to her father. She had not heard from Richard Thorne since the mummers' play. He had promised to speak to Elias by the 30th. His silence felt like a betrayal. He feared he had failed her, choosing self-preservation over passion.
As she came downstairs, she found Samuel, identity versus expectation, in the library, looking utterly defeated. "I cannot do it, Elle," Samuel whispered, terrified. "Papa has lost a major client today. Aunt Honoria said so. I cannot compound his troubles by telling him I hate the law. I must keep my peace and follow his wishes." "No," Eleanor said, her own voice sharp with sudden decision. "You must not. Look at Papa. He chose his conscience over his career today. You must choose your true self over his expectation. The past is cleansed only by facing the future honestly." The strength in her own voice hardened her resolve. She realized Richard's silence was irrelevant. Her vow was to be true to herself. If Richard had failed, she would refuse Arthur Davies outright, enduring the public shame rather than marrying without love. The cleansing of the past required her to reject the social contract of convenience. Thomas's act of first footing. As the New Year's Eve dinner began, the house was filled with strained, formal politeness. At the end of the meal, Thomas excused himself. He slipped out the back door, carrying the velvet-wrapped wooden ship. He knew the superstition. The New Year's luck was dependent on the first footer. His own small, private belief was that the New Year's luck should belong to those who needed it most. He ran through the cold streets back to the wool mills. He found the lodging house again, and, after knocking softly, handed the parcel to the startled proprietor. "This is for a boy named Michael," Thomas instructed, his teeth chattering. "Tell him it is from his friend, and tell him, Happy New Year. He is the first to receive a gift in the new year." Thomas hurried home. As he crossed his own threshold, running back into the warmth of the kitchen, he was unknowingly performing his own sacred act of first footing, ensuring that the first act of the new year, even if only for Michael, was one of generosity and hope. He had discharged his small, brave vow, ensuring the new year would start with a clean, selfless slate. The evening culminated with the family gathered in the parlor, watching the grandfather clock tick towards midnight. Elias looked at Charlotte, both holding immense, painful secrets, yet bound by a new, courageous honesty. Eleanor waited, rigid with tension, for Arthur Davies's inevitable question. Samuel gripped his hands, ready to defend his own path. The clock chimed 11, signaling the final, inexorable hour. The past was cleansed, the vows were set, and the future, terrifying, uncertain, but honest, was now only 60 minutes away. The celebration and reflection of New Year's Day, the making or breaking of resolutions. The night of December 31st, 1888, was still and bitterly cold. Inside the Ashworth parlor, the gas lamps burned brightly, competing with the fierce blaze in the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of pine, champagne, and profound, barely contained anxiety. The room was packed with friends, associates, and the extended family, all gathered for the obligatory New Year's Eve assembly. Yet for the Ashworths, this was not a social event. It was a deadline. The grandfather clock in the hall stood sentinel, its heavy pendulum swinging through the final, inexorable minutes of the year. The central agonizing tension was fixed on Eleanor Ashworth. Arthur Davies, implacable in his evening attire, stood close to Elias, having secured his prearranged, fateful moment. He carried a small velvet box, the unmistakable sign of a proposal. Elias was pale. He had told Charlotte about losing Sir Alister Finch that morning. He was financially diminished, but morally elevated. His pride now rested on the success of this match, the last vestige of the orderly life he had planned. He nodded discreetly to Arthur, giving him the cue. Arthur approached Eleanor, his movements practiced and formal. He began a carefully rehearsed speech, focused on the security of his estate and the respectability of their combined futures. Eleanor, rigid in her gown,
was braced for two things: the sound of the clock striking 12 and the crushing disappointment that Richard Thorne had failed to appear. He had promised to speak to her father by the 30th. It was now 11:58 p.m. His silence was deafening, forcing her to confront the breaking of her own vow to marry for passion. "If he will not fight for me, then I must fight for myself," she thought. She waited for Arthur to pause for breath, intending to deliver a definitive, graceful refusal that would shake the room. The door swings open. At precisely 11:59 p.m., just as Arthur reached the critical moment of taking the ring box from his pocket, the front door of the house was flung open with a decisive, chilling crack that silenced the parlor. A figure stood silhouetted against the dark, frozen night: Richard Thorne. He was not dressed for a ball. His overcoat was rough, dusted with frost, and his shoes were muddy. He was disheveled, having clearly run the distance. He walked straight into the parlor, ignoring the stares and the shocked silence. "Mr. Ashworth?" Richard said, his voice loud and ragged, cutting through the celebratory chatter. He stood directly between Arthur Davies and Eleanor, facing Elias. "I apologize for my dramatic entrance. I was delayed seeing a client in Bristol, but I have come to keep my vow." This was the climax of Eleanor's conflict. Richard had arrived at the absolute last minute, fulfilling his promise to act. "Your vow?" Elias asked, his face darkening with intense anger. He looked from Richard's muddy boots to Arthur's pristine velvet box. "Mr. Thorne, you are trespassing on a private family occasion." "It is not private, sir, when the happiness of your daughter is at stake."
Midnight, and the vows collide. The sudden, powerful chimes of the grandfather clock began. 12. The noise was deafening, signaling the arrival of the new year, January 1st, 1889. As the bells rang out, two separate events unfolded almost simultaneously. 1. Eleanor's choice. She did not look at her father, nor at Arthur. She looked directly at Richard, meeting his desperate gaze with a blazing certainty. She reached out, not to take his hand, but to touch the rough, frost-dusted wool of his coat. It felt real, tangible, and true. "Richard Thorne," she said, her voice clear and strong over the final ringing chime. "I accept your vow. I will not marry for convenience." 2. Samuel's first footing. Inspired by Richard's courage and terrified by his father's crestfallen expression, which he mistakenly attributed to the loss of Arthur, not the loss of Finch, Samuel, identity versus expectation, saw his chance. The new year had begun. He would be the first footer of honesty. He rushed back to the drawing room where he had hidden his sketchbook. He ran back into the parlor, thrusting the drawings of the schooner into Elias's hand. "Papa," Samuel stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush, "I know you lost business today, and I know you want me to be a lawyer, but I cannot. I vow to you, I am meant for the sea. I am a builder, Papa, not a barrister." The collision of the two vows, Eleanor's rejection of security for passion, and Samuel's rejection of expectation for identity, was overwhelming. Elias, already reeling from the loss of Finch, now faced the destruction of his final, carefully laid plans. He looked from Samuel's passionate face to Eleanor's defiant one, then to the determined working man standing between his daughter and the wealthy suitor. He saw the fire of self-determination in all three of them. The aftermath, New Year's Day. The party broke up immediately. Arthur Davies retreated, humiliated, followed by the scandalized Aunt Honoria. The Ashworth family was left alone in the cold, littered parlor on the morning of New Year's Day. Elias spent the morning in his study. He had failed in his attempts to maintain order.
He had lost his client, his preferred son-in-law, and his heir to the law practice. Yet the price of his own vow, the choice of mercy, had prepared him for this moment. He had already chosen conscience over convenience. Charlotte, truth versus protection, knowing the true cost of their upheaval, came to him, putting her hand on his shoulder. "Elias," she began gently, "your children have chosen honesty. You taught them that truth is the highest law, and now I must perform my own act of cleansing. I must tell you about Clara." Charlotte confessed her 16-year-old silence of vow. Elias listened, his face showing a weary understanding rather than shock. "You protected your sister, Charlotte. A man who sacrificed his career for a printer cannot fault a woman who risked her reputation for her blood." The air was cleared of both secrets. Elias finally stood free of the shackles of wealth and secrecy. He called his children into the parlor. He looked at Richard, standing beside a relieved Eleanor. "Mr. Thorne," Elias said, his voice softer than they had ever heard it, "I made the mistake of equating love with solvency. My children have taught me otherwise. I have lost my way this year, but I see now that your passion is your integrity. You have my consent, provided you build your future with the same courage you showed tonight." Then he turned to Samuel, picking up the sketchbook. He turned the pages, examining the intricate rigging. "The law requires a firm foundation, Samuel, but so does a ship. If you have the drive to build, then I will help you lay your first keel. Go to Bristol, find an apprenticeship. Show me this work is not just a dream." The resolutions were broken and remade. Elias abandoned his resolution to prioritize wealth. Eleanor broke her vow to follow propriety. Samuel broke his vow of silence. The family had achieved a profound reconciliation, accepting the uncertainty of the future for the integrity of the present. As the sun finally broke through the clouds on New Year's Day, Elias stepped onto the street for the ceremonial first footing. He carried a piece of coal for luck, but the truth was his luck had already changed. He had lost everything external, but gained everything internal. The spirit of Christmastide, the honest, vulnerable beginning had arrived. Introducing the specific rituals and customs of January 5th, the eve of Epiphany, including the king cake tradition. January 5th, 12th night, was the absolute pinnacle and traditional conclusion of the Christmastide celebration. It was a night of inversion, masked identity, and symbolic chaos, preparing the way for the solemnity of Epiphany, January 6th, which commemorated the arrival of the Magi. In the Ashworth household, the atmosphere was of profound, yet relieved, uncertainty. The family had survived the catastrophic New Year's Eve, paying the price for honesty and gaining a fragile, genuine happiness. Tonight they hosted a large, boisterous party, not to uphold social reputation, but simply to embrace the messy, joyful life they had chosen. The preparations, chaos, and freedom. The parlor, which had been the silent witness to so many secrets and conflicts, was transformed for the 12th night revel. The rules of the day were simple. The world was turned upside down. Eleanor and Richard Thorne, newly, albeit scandalously, engaged, oversaw the decorations. The heavy Christmas greens were removed from the walls, replaced by garlands of ivy and laurel, symbols of eternal life. The tree, which would be taken down tomorrow, was illuminated one last time, its dozen candles casting warm, flickering light. "It feels almost reckless," Eleanor confessed to Richard, tying a sprig of mistletoe above a doorway. "The last night before we must take down the holly and return to rigid routine. We have done so much to achieve propriety, and tonight we celebrate impropriety." Richard smiled, pulling her into a quick, private embrace. "We celebrate truth, my dear, and truth in Bath society is the greatest impropriety of all." Elias and Charlotte watched their daughter with a mixture of apprehension and pride. Charlotte's attention, however, was still split. Her sister Clara had been safely housed in a small, respectable lodging on the other side of Bath, awaiting safe passage to France that Charlotte had arranged. Tonight, Charlotte had quietly instructed the cook to prepare a basket of the finest Twelfth Night sweets to be delivered to Clara after midnight, her final necessary act of protection before the year fully turned.
The tradition of the 12th cake. The central ritual of the evening was the unveiling of the 12th cake, or king cake. It was a magnificent creation, rich, fruit-laden, iced white, and lavishly decorated. Baked within its depths were two hidden tokens, a bean and a pea. The person who received the slice containing the bean would be crowned the king of the feast, and the person who received the pea would be crowned the queen of the feast. For the rest of the night, their word would be absolute law, a deliberate, temporary suspension of all social order. As the guests arrived, a mix of Ashworth allies, curious neighbors, and a slightly rebellious younger set, the atmosphere grew electric with anticipation. Everyone, from the highest-ranking gentleman to the most timid spinster, was equally subjected to the random draw of the cake. The crowning of the king and queen. The cake was brought out at the height of the evening. Elias performed the solemn slicing ceremony, cutting the great cake into exactly 30 equal portions. Charlotte then distributed the plates with the air of a priestess distributing fortunes. The parlor fell silent as guests tentatively tasted their slices, searching for the telltale hardness of the tokens. Suddenly, a loud, delighted shout broke the silence. Thomas, the 9-year-old, erupted in shock, holding up the bean. A wave of laughter and disbelief swept the room. Thomas was the king of the feast. Then, a quiet, almost shy voice announced the queen. It was Mr. Ponsonby, the printer, whom Elias had invited as an act of genuine friendship and to restore his public dignity. Ponsonby held up the small pea, his eyes shining with a mixture of embarrassment and overwhelming fortune. The crowning was immediate and absurd. Thomas, crowned with a ridiculous paper coronet, was hoisted onto Elias's study chair, his small form dominating the room. Ponsonby, with his own simple crown, stood beside him, looking completely overwhelmed. The reign of King Thomas. The chaos commenced instantly. Thomas, emboldened by his regal authority, immediately exercised his supreme temporary power. "King Thomas decrees," he announced in a squeaky voice that had to be repeated by a laughing Elias, "no one may address their parents formally. You must call them by silly nicknames, and all must dance to the music that Samuel plays." This decree was a liberation for the household. Elias and Charlotte were forced to call each other Captain and Sparrow. More profoundly, Thomas's command about the music provided the final necessary stage for his brother. Samuel, identity versus expectation, having confessed his vocational dream to Elias, was now faced with the opportunity to publicly embrace it. He didn't know how to play the popular waltzes. Instead, under the decree of King Thomas, he took the family cello and with trembling fingers played a tune he had learned from a sea shanty, a rough, rhythmic, powerful song about sailing and freedom. The guests, startled, first hesitated, but the infectious rhythm and the sheer unexpectedness of the music soon compelled them. They began to dance, not with formal, measured steps, but with a new, lively, and slightly wild energy. Samuel, playing his soul's true song, was finally at peace. He looked at his father, who was watching him with undisguised pride, a final reconciliation of expectation and identity achieved. Ponsonby's final act. Mr. Ponsonby, the quiet printer, stood beside his young king, enjoying his temporary elevation and the unexpected joy of the crowd. He quietly sought out Elias.
"Mr. Ashworth," he whispered, pulling the small velvet-wrapped parcel out of his pocket. "Before my reign ends, I must return this to your son." He handed the parcel to Elias, explaining that Thomas had entrusted him with the precious wooden ship carving, a symbol of escape. "He told me it meant protection from bad weather," Ponsonby said, "and I must thank you, sir. You did not manage to stop the foreclosure, but by asking me to this gathering, you restored something far more important than my shop, my dignity. The kindness of your family, your wife, and especially your youngest boy, has convinced me that I can begin again. I vow to open a new, smaller press by the end of the year." Elias, accepting the little ship, was moved by this final, unexpected act of grace. His sacrifice of his career, which had seemed so catastrophic, had genuinely given life to another man's hope. The true meaning of mercy was confirmed. The final mystery. As the night wore on and the revelry reached its peak, Charlotte slipped away. She carried the last basket of Twelfth Night treats, walking quietly towards her sister's lodging. She delivered the basket to the landlady, slipping her a sovereign, with instructions to deliver the sweets only after midnight. It was a final safe provision. As Charlotte turned to walk back home, she heard a soft, musical sound coming from a hidden alleyway, a fiddle playing a haunting, familiar Irish tune. Standing in the shadows was a lone figure, their face obscured by the fog. It was a person dressed in simple traveler's clothes. The figure stopped playing as Charlotte approached. The figure did not speak, but simply performed the small childhood signal she knew so well, a quick tug on the left earlobe. It was Clara, not the fool, but a sober, grateful woman, playing a final private farewell song for her sister. Charlotte felt a surge of love and sorrow. She couldn't speak, fearing the emotion would betray her. She only nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their renewed bond. Clara smiled, a genuine, honest smile that replaced the fool's grotesque mask, and then turned and vanished into the fog, ready to accept the new future Charlotte had purchased for her. Charlotte walked back towards her home, the sounds of the distant Twelfth Night revel still faintly reaching her. The house had served its purpose as a sanctuary. Her own vow of protection was fulfilled, not through secrecy, but through the courage to act openly. The mystery of Twelfth Night was not in the masks or the crowning, but in the profound, irreversible changes that the 12 days of chaos had wrought upon the Ashworth family, preparing them for the dawn of Epiphany and the hard, glorious reality of the new year. Secrets are uncovered, and essential truths of the characters' pasts are revealed amidst the festivity. January 6th, Epiphany Day, dawned cold and clear. It was the final day of Christmastide, the day that celebrated the manifestation of Christ to the world, symbolized by the arrival of the Magi. Just as the Magi revealed their gifts, this day demanded that the Ashworth family reveal their true selves to the world and to each other, accepting the full consequence of the vows they had made and broken. The house was oddly silent. The chaos of the Twelfth Night revel was over. The decorations were systematically being taken down, marking the taking away of the season. The parlor, stripped of its greenery, looked suddenly stark and angular, no longer hiding secrets beneath its festive facade. The whispers of Bath society. The first revelation came not from within the family, but from the outside. Elias Ashworth sat in his study, attempting to focus on the diminished legal files of his remaining smaller clientele. The post brought a small torrent of letters, not New Year's greetings, but pointed, gossipy correspondence detailing the disastrous events of the New Year's Eve assembly. The whispers of Bath society had reached a crescendo. The ruin of Ashworth. Letters from former associates confirmed that Elias's standing was irrevocably damaged. His termination by Sir Alistair Finch was public knowledge, and his decision to advocate for Mr. Ponsonby, the printer, was cited as proof of his sudden, sentimental lapse and professional unreliability. Elias read the veiled insults, the thinly disguised pity, and felt a profound sense of peace. The whispers were proof that he had chosen his integrity over their approval. His career was irrevocably changed, but his conscience was clear, the ultimate revelation of his priorities. The scandal of Eleanor. Aunt Honoria had penned a blistering letter to Charlotte, copied to Elias, detailing Eleanor's unpardonable public rejection of security and her reckless attachment to a penniless architect. Honoria declared that the Ashworth name was now irrevocably tarnished and that Eleanor's prospects were ruined. The cost of Eleanor's passion was now clear: social ostracism. Yet when Elias showed the letter to Eleanor, she merely laughed, holding Richard's hand. The truth revealed was that the love she had chosen was stronger than the scorn of society. Charlotte's emotional unburdening. Charlotte, truth versus protection, was the last member of the family to fully unburden herself. She and Elias had spoken about Clara, but the sheer emotional weight of the past 16 years remained. She found Eleanor in the drawing room, carefully wrapping the last of the ribbons from the tree. "There is one more truth you must know, my love," she began, her voice low. "It concerns the price of reputation, the thing you so bravely rejected." Then Charlotte revealed the whole truth about Clara: the youthful indiscretion, the enforced flight, the years of silence, and Clara's recent desperate appearance as the mummer's fool. She explained that she had seen Clara the night before, and that her sister was safely on her way to the coast, disguised and protected for her journey abroad. Eleanor listened, utterly stunned.
"Mama," Eleanor whispered, her eyes filling with tears, "you risked everything, all these years for your sister. You knew the cost of social shame, yet you still helped her. And then you allowed me to choose Richard, knowing the scandal would intensify. I learned that protecting a secret is far more damaging than protecting a person, Eleanor," Charlotte said, meeting her daughter's gaze. "I vowed to silence the past. You vowed to speak your truth. Yours was the braver act. I protected her body. You protected your soul. The revelation is that true love, whether sisterly or romantic, often requires a flight from convention." This moment was a profound reconciliation between mother and daughter. Eleanor, now seeing her mother as a complex woman who fought her own battles, understood the true meaning of the vulnerability behind the polished facade. The revelation of the lost ship. The most touching revelation involved the quietest members of the family, Thomas and Mr. Ponsonby. Thomas, thinking he had completed his quiet vow by delivering the wooden ship carving to Michael, was confused when Elias presented the wrapped parcel to him on Epiphany morning. "Papa, Mr. Ponsonby was supposed to deliver it to Michael," Thomas said. Elias explained the full story. Ponsonby, in his restored dignity, had returned the ship to Elias, claiming he had successfully guarded the hope of escape, but that the final act of giving must belong to Thomas. Elias suggested that they ride out immediately to the mill district. When they arrived, the weather-beaten proprietor of the lodging house directed them to a small open shed where Michael was helping his father patch an old fishing net. Thomas walked up to Michael and quietly presented the ship. "It's yours now," he said, simply. Michael looked at the intricate carving, then at Thomas, his eyes wide. He knew this was not an ordinary toy. "It is the life that endures even in the deepest winter," Michael said, echoing the words Thomas had learned about the Christmas tree. The revelation was immediate for Elias. Michael's family was poor, but not without dignity or knowledge. Elias, realizing Ponsonby was not the only good man in this neighborhood, saw an opportunity. He spoke to Michael's father, offering to hire him, a former sailor, for the care of Samuel's future launch vessel. Elias, having lost a client, gained a craftsman. Samuel's true bearing. Later that day, Samuel, identity versus expectation, presented Elias with a meticulously drafted letter, formally requesting an apprenticeship in a shipyard in Bristol. The letter was mature, reasoned, and full of professional purpose. Elias read it and nodded, his pride immense. "It is a fine piece of work, Samuel. A man who can draft a proper letter can manage any contract. You have found your true bearing." But the final revelation came from the outside. Elias had arranged a large bonfire in the garden, the final traditional act of Christmastide, burning the holly and the laurel to signify the end of the season. As the smoke rose, Elias saw a familiar, imposing figure standing across the street, Sir Alister Finch. Finch approached the garden gate, his face unreadable. "Ashworth," he called out, "I hear you've had a difficult week, lost your heir to the sea, your daughter to a pauper, and your largest client to your conscience." Elias stepped forward, standing tall. "I have paid the full price, Finch, and I am never richer." Finch paused, observing the scene, the family standing together, strong and united amidst the smoke. "Ponsonby is back in business, I hear. You taught the man tenacity. I am bound to admire that. And that young man, Thorne, he just won the town hall competition. A fine builder, as it turns out." Finch paused again, delivering his final revelation. "I require a man of moral courage on my team, Ashworth. You were disloyal to me, but you were loyal to your principles. That is a rare commodity. I am willing to offer you the head counsel position for my subsidiary interests, less lucrative but entirely your own domain, and you may hire Ponsonby to print your stationery." Elias had not merely regained a client, he had redefined his career on his own terms. His act of mercy had led to a far deeper, more honorable reconciliation with the law. The Ashworths stood together, watching the last vestiges of the old year burn away. The Epiphany had brought not just light, but profound, honest truth. The old house, stripped of its disguises, now sheltered a family united not by convention, but by the shared, hard-won courage of their individual vows and revelations. The new beginning had truly dawned. The central, spectacular event of the story, a great 12th night party or ball that serves as the climax. The evening of January 5, 1989, was the final, breathtaking exhale of the Christmastide. The Ashworths' home, stripped of its simple holiday greenery and transformed by the lavish decorations of the 12th night revels, was now the setting for the grand masque. This masquerade ball was the traditional climax of the 12 days, a night where all social hierarchy was symbolically inverted or concealed, where the familiar became foreign, and where the final passionate acts of the season were performed under the cloak of anonymity. The Ashworths' parlor, drawing room, and dining room were thrown open, forming a labyrinth of sound and spectacle. Hundreds of candles blazed, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the elaborate costumes. Musicians, strategically placed, filled the air with swirling, frenetic waltz melodies. The masquerade of identity. The guests arrived, their true selves hidden behind velvet, silk, and painted pasteboard. The act of masking itself was a commentary on the social tensions of the past 12 days. Elias Ashworth, Justice versus Mercy, wore a severe Venetian mask, the traditional costume of the lawgiver. Despite his financial anxieties and the moral cost of his recent decisions, he presented a facade of iron control. Charlotte Ashworth, Truth versus Protection, was dressed as the silent oracle, her face completely covered by a silver, expressionless mask. It was a physical representation of the years she had spent guarding Clara's secret, now an empty shell because her truth had been spoken. Eleanor, Passion versus Propriety, newly engaged to Richard Thorne, chose the costume of the Huntress, a figure of decisive action and unapologetic pursuit. She wore a simple, confident mask, her happiness radiating despite the social whispers that followed her. Richard, her defiant fiancé, wore the humble yet symbolic mask of the architect, a simple, plain design that suggested structure and honest labor, standing in contrast to the opulence around him. Samuel, Identity versus Expectation, having chosen his path to the sea, wore the mask of Neptune, the god of the ocean, a costume that spoke volumes about his future without saying a single word. The night was intoxicating. Under the cover of the masks, people spoke with a shocking, temporary freedom. social barriers dissolved. An unknown gentleman could converse intimately with a duke, or a young architect, Richard, could directly challenge the opinions of powerful financiers, Elias's former associates, without immediate consequence. The Dance of Defiance. The masque reached its height during the central grand waltz. Richard, in his humble architect mask, claimed Eleanor, her huntress, for the dance. As they spun across the floor, their dance was a public, non-verbal declaration of their victory over convention. Eleanor felt the gaze of every gossiping woman in the room, but beneath the mask, she smiled, knowing they could not touch her joy.
"You are quiet, my architect," Eleanor whispered, her voice husky. "I am observing, my huntress," Richard replied, his voice low. "I see the masks of avarice, the masks of expectation, and the masks of fear. They fear the light, but tonight they grant us our freedom."
Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by Arthur Davies, Eleanor's former suitor, wearing the mask of the banker, a severe gold-painted face that radiated resentment. "The huntress dances with a poor catch," Arthur sneered, his voice disguised by the formal tone of the mask. "The security of gold is a far steadier partner than the promise of passion." Eleanor stood her ground. "The promise of passion builds empires, Sir Banker. Gold merely maintains graves." With a decisive turn, she drew Richard away, their united movement a final, irrevocable rejection of the safe path. The mask had forced the resolution of her romantic conflict into a public, dramatic display. Samuel's silent farewell. While Eleanor fought her battle, Samuel used the mask for a quiet, personal farewell. He knew he would leave Bath soon for his apprenticeship in Bristol. He found his younger brother, Thomas, near the great fireplace. Thomas, dressed as King Arthur, carrying a miniature wooden sword, looked bewildered by the sheer noise and motion of the ball. "Thomas," Samuel whispered, pulling him aside. "Look at Neptune." Thomas looked at the sea god in the mask. "I leave tomorrow, Thomas. I'm going to build ships," Samuel confided. "This is the last time I will see this room as just this room. From now on, it will be the room where I chose the sea." Thomas, understanding the weight of the moment, embraced his brother tightly. "Go well, Neptune. I will keep the fire lit for you, and the tide will turn you home." In that moment of shared sincerity, Samuel felt a final, complete absolution. He had not only secured his father's blessing, but had secured his brother's understanding. He was ready to face the lonely, challenging reality of his new path. The Shadow and the Sanctuary. The most complex drama of the night involved Charlotte and the lingering shadow of Clara. Charlotte, the silent oracle, moved through the room, her every sense heightened. She had arranged for Clara's final departure, and the cab was due to take her to the coast after midnight. Charlotte was deeply anxious, knowing that the smallest delay or coincidence could reveal her secret to the entire assembly. As she passed the shadows near the staircase, a hand reached out and gently touched her silver mask. She froze. Standing there was a tall, familiar figure, Sir Alistair Finch, Elias's former client. Finch was dressed as the Grim Reaper, a satirical nod to his ruthlessly cold business dealings. "The silent oracle is wise," Finch whispered, his voice dangerously close. "Does she know that her husband's reputation is quite destroyed? Does she know the shame her sister brought upon the family years ago? The whispers follow her even tonight." Charlotte forced herself to remain calm, speaking through the silver mask. "The oracle knows that shame is merely a shadow, Sir Reaper, and a shadow cannot kill what is already free." "But a shadow can compromise your husband's rehabilitation," Finch countered, his tone changing from menace to calculation. "I admire Elias's courage, but I require a certain guarantee of silence concerning the past. I want assurance that your family will not interfere in certain matters."
Charlotte understood the unspoken threat. Finch was demanding leverage. He would use Clara's secret to ensure Elias remained pliable in his new role. "The past is gone, Sir Reaper," Charlotte said, looking him straight in his masked eyes. "My family will only ever move forward. The Oracle vows it." Finch nodded, satisfied. He had extracted his guarantee, but in doing so, he had underestimated Charlotte's strength. Her final act of protection was not one of flight, but one of defiance against a masked enemy. The end of the mask. As the clock neared 2 a.m., a servant announced the final ceremonial act, the unmasking. The music slowed to a halt. In a synchronized movement, the guests removed their masks, revealing faces flushed with champagne, exertion, and the emotional drama of the night. The transformation was startling. The powerful returned to their power, and the vulnerable were exposed. Elias, removing his lawgiver mask, felt the chill of the room. He looked at Charlotte, who stood revealed as the weary but steadfast matriarch. He saw Richard and Eleanor, their faces open and triumphant. He saw Samuel, his eyes already fixed on the distance. He looked at the chaos of the room, the scattered ribbons, the overturned chairs, the remnants of the 12th cake. The mask had served its purpose. It had allowed for necessary risk, necessary truth, and the final beautiful acts of defiance. The family had faced their external threats and their internal fears, and they had emerged together and true. The moment when the designated king and queen of the feast, chosen by the bean in the cake, exert their temporary chaotic rule. The moment the 12th cake was sliced and the tokens revealed, the Ashworth parlor underwent a psychological shift. The solemn, regulated atmosphere of the Victorian home was momentarily suspended by the ancient, intoxicating custom of the king and queen of the feast. The winners, 9-year-old Thomas holding the bean and the humble printer, Mr. Ponsonby, holding the pea, were crowned with ridiculous paper coronets. The custom demanded that the king and queen should rule the entire party for the night, their commands obeyed instantly, regardless of rank or reason. This inversion of order, the child and the financially ruined tradesman ruling the elite of Bath, was the very essence of the Christmastide revelry. The coronation of chaos. The guests, compelled by tradition and the giddy release of the evening, roared their applause. The formal master of ceremonies, a dignified neighbor, handed Thomas a wooden scepter, cementing his power. Ponsonby, utterly bewildered but gracious, was giving a silk sash. Thomas, elevated to the study chair, his temporary throne, surveyed his realm. He was no longer the quiet, anxious boy who worried about the ethics of fictional heroes. He was King Thomas I, the embodiment of untainted, imaginative authority. His first decree was not malicious or greedy, but a demand for genuine joy, a reaction against the stifling formality he had experienced all Christmastide. "I decree," squeaked King Thomas, his voice magnified by the hilarity of the crowd, "that no one shall use the word propriety for the rest of the night, and everyone must wear a silly hat, even Papa." The guests scattered, laughing, grabbing bits of ribbon, napkins, and borrowed children's caps. Elias Ashworth, the solemn solicitor who had just lost his biggest client and his life plan, found himself crowned with a plume of peacock feathers fashioned from a fireplace brush. Charlotte, his serene wife, wore a kitchen tower tied into a turban. The forced absurdity was a therapeutic release. Gentle rule. Ponsonby, the designated queen. The pea traditionally crowned the female consort, but the custom was flexible, realized his role was to temper the child's chaos with gentle, restorative purpose. He looked out at the assembly, spotting Eleanor and Richard Thorne standing close and defiant in their respective masks. Queen Ponsonby issued his decree aimed directly at Elias.
I decree that tonight all conversations must focus on what brings one true joy, not what earns the largest profit. And the two young architects among us, Mr. Richard Thorne and young Samuel Ashworth, must be given a platform to present their visions for the future. This was Ponsonby's profound act of gratitude and reconciliation to the family that had shown him mercy. He used his temporary power to elevate Richard and Samuel, giving their unconventional futures the stamp of official approval that Elias had struggled to grant. The crowd quieted, curious. Elias, under the tyranny of the crown, had no choice but to comply. He stepped aside as Richard, the architect in his simple mask, was invited to the center of the room. He spoke not of commissions, but of the philosophy of building, of creating structures that supported human connection and light, not just wealth. His passion was undeniable, silencing the gossip about his poverty. Then came Samuel, identity versus expectation, whose turn was even more terrifying. He stood before the crowd in his Neptune mask, his chest heaving with nerves. He spoke of the majesty of the open sea and his commitment to mastering the craft of shipbuilding. Then he fulfilled Ponsonby's decree by rushing to the family cello and playing his sea shanty, the music a raw, powerful expression of his true self. Elias, watching his son play his heart out, felt the last vestige of his professional expectation crumble.
The jester reached up and, with a silent gesture, slowly removed his mask. He was a kind-faced, older gentleman Charlotte had never met, but his eyes held an earnest loyalty. "She found the only forgiveness she needed, madam," he said softly. "Yours. She carried the scent of the pine and the memory of the candle in the window with her. The shame is gone. You are both free." This was the final, profound revelation of Charlotte's vow. Her act of protection had successfully transitioned Clara from a disgraced secret into a woman with a future. She thanked the jester, watching him melt back into the crowd, a hidden agent of grace in the midst of the chaos. The king's final decree. As the party began to wind down, King Thomas, exhausted but triumphant, issued his final, most significant decree. He pointed his scepter at the Christmas tree, now shedding needles onto the floor. "I decree that tomorrow, Epiphany Day, the entire family must spend the morning together, silent, taking down the tree, and no one must speak of money or law or contracts, only of the journey ahead." This was a wise, intuitive command. The child, weary of the adult complexities, demanded a return to the simplicity of the home and the unity of the family. He forced them to slow down, to engage in the reflective, essential labor of putting the season away together. Elias, looking at his king, his son, felt a wave of tender love and respect. He raised his hand and bowed deeply. "The king commands it. The law is suspended. We obey." The reign of the king and the fool was complete. In its wake, the social order was restored, but the Ashworth family was irrevocably transformed. The chaotic inversion of Twelfth Night had served its purpose, clearing the air and consecrating the brave new futures of Eleanor, Samuel, Elias, and Charlotte. The grand masque was about to begin, but the true drama, the resolution of their lives, had already been achieved under the guise of absurdity. The morning of January 6th, Epiphany Day, brought the inevitable reckoning. The 12 days of license, of charity, revelry, secrecy, and defiance were over. The cold, clear light of day illuminated the wreckage of the Ashworth parlor. Scattered confetti, smudged candle wax, and the heavy silence that follows intense celebration. The temporary chaotic rule of the king and the fool had ended,
and the permanent consequences of the family's choices now demanded to be faced. The reckoning was not a single event, but a series of quiet, unavoidable confrontations that finalized the major turning points of their journey. Elias and Charlotte, the reckoning of price. Elias Ashworth and Charlotte began their day by fulfilling King Thomas's final decree, silently taking down the great Christmas tree. It was a shared, intimate labor, a final, reflective ceremony. As they carefully untied the popcorn chains and extinguished the last symbolic candles, Elias spoke first, breaking the silence required by the king. "The reckoning is here, Charlotte," Elias murmured, looking at the now bare tree trunk. "Finch knows everything. His representative was at the mask, whispering. He knows about Clara. He told me so. He will use her past to ensure my obedience in the future." The full catastrophic price of their honesty was laid bare: professional ruin for Elias and permanent exposure of the family secret for Charlotte. "What will you do?" Charlotte asked, facing him. Elias looked at the empty hearth where the fire had once symbolized his secure life. "I will not be bought, Charlotte. Finch wants me to run his subsidiary interests, a role beneath my skill, but a lifeline nonetheless. I will accept, but on one condition: my freedom to operate without moral compromise. If he threatens Clara, if he threatens my conscience, I walk away. The reckoning is that I will choose honor over wealth every single time now." Charlotte smiled, a tired but genuine expression. "Then you have paid the price, and you have won. We shall face the new year poor in reputation, but wealthy in peace." This was their major turning point, the conscious and definitive acceptance of a diminished but principled life, thereby finalizing the conflict between justice and mercy. Eleanor and Richard, the reckoning of reality. Eleanor and Richard Thorne faced their reckoning in the drawing room, surrounded by the discarded remnants of the mask costumes. Eleanor, still exhilarated by their public defiance, was suddenly confronted by the practical reality of their choice. "The whispers will follow us for years, Richard," she said, folding the rough silk of his discarded architect mask. "Aunt Honoria has already sent word that she will cease all correspondence. We will be excluded from the best houses. You will lose business." Richard, however, was already busy drafting. He was not drafting architectural plans, but a budget. "I have faced the numbers, my huntress," Richard stated, his eyes shining with focus. "We will not starve. We will have a small, honest life. We will live in a rented cottage in Bristol, near the new docks. I will take on smaller commissions, and you will teach drawing or music to supplement. We lose the masks of Bath, but we gain the truth of Bristol." He presented the simple, austere budget, a life stripped bare of luxury, focused entirely on the necessity of work and love. Eleanor stared at the paper. The number for her personal allowance was nearly zero. She was facing the reckoning of trading her comfortable, luxurious past for an honest, demanding future. She traced her finger over the numbers, then looked at Richard, his face alight with courageous certainty. "Then I shall learn to cook and manage a small household," Eleanor declared, her voice firm. "The reckoning is that I trade ease for truth, and I accept the terms. A cottage in Bristol with you is infinitely more valuable than a mansion in Bath without you." This was their major turning point, the deliberate embrace of hardship and labor, consecrating their romantic vow with practical economic reality. Samuel and Thomas, the reckoning of departure. The younger brothers faced the emotional reckoning of inevitable departure. Samuel, Neptune, was packing his trunk for Bristol, leaving immediately to secure his apprenticeship. Thomas, King Arthur, sat on the trunk, his small hands holding his wooden ship carving. "I cannot go with you, Neptune," Thomas whispered. "King Arthur must stay here and watch the hearth." "The hearth needs tending, Thomas," Samuel replied, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "But the sea calls, and I must answer. This is the last time we are just brothers in this room. Next time I shall be a shipbuilder." Thomas realized his kingly decree, which required the family to stay together, was impossible to fulfill. The very act of finding their true selves demanded separation. He handed Samuel the wooden ship. "This is for your first journey. It is a symbol of the life that endures even in the deepest winter. Bring it back when you return a master builder." Samuel tucked the carving into his breast pocket. "I will, King Arthur, and I will send you drawings of my progress." Their major turning point was the acceptance of necessary separation. Samuel was free to find his identity, and Thomas was left to take up his new important role, the emotional protector of the home.
The final act of reckoning came from the outside, the inevitable return of the man whose fate had ignited Elias's moral crisis. A loud, determined knock sounded on the front door. The servant opened it to reveal Mr. Ponsonby, the printer, the former queen of the feast. He was no longer dressed in his velvet and paper regalia. He wore his simple, clean working clothes. He did not ask for Elias, he asked for Thomas. "King Thomas," Ponsonby said, bowing low as he entered the hall, "I have returned to fulfill the final obligation of the feast." Ponsonby had not come to ask for aid, but to give it. He handed Thomas a small, heavy packet. Inside were coins, not many, but enough for a year's rent on a small cottage. "I won the bean, King Thomas, but you won the life," Ponsonby explained. "This is the last of my old shop's funds, but I kept them safe. I will use this to open my new press, small, honest, and free of debt. I vow to you, I will succeed." Ponsonby's reckoning was the acceptance of his failure and the courageous commitment to a clean slate. He had lost his legacy, but gained his future. As Ponsonby departed, leaving the family alone, Elias looked at the small pile of coins, the symbol of the costly mercy he had shown. He looked at Eleanor and Richard, resolute in their commitment to poverty. He looked at Samuel, standing ready to leave. "The reckoning is complete," Elias said, a profound certainty settling over him. "We have lost the chains of our old lives and gained the freedom of our new ones. We are stripped bare, and we are stronger for it." The family stood together in the stark, unadorned parlor, ready to face the new year. The Epiphany sunlight, flooding through the clear glass windows, felt not like a bright future, but like a hard, honest present. January 6th, Epiphany, the spiritual and emotional resolution, symbolizing the journey of the Magi and the dawning of new understanding. January 6th, Epiphany Day, was the end of the journey. The theological significance of the day, marking the arrival of the Magi, or wise men, was not lost on the Ashworth family. It was a day of theophany, manifestation of the divine, and revelation, where the truth, like the light of a guiding star, was finally made plain. The family began the day by fulfilling King Thomas's last command, silently clearing away the last of the festive reminders. The physical act of stripping the home bare mirrored the spiritual cleansing the family had undergone. The journey's end, a new understanding. The silence in the parlor was profound, broken only by the soft snick of shears as Charlotte cut the final strands of ivy. She looked at her home, now returned to its normal state, orderly but fundamentally changed. Her own journey was resolved. Her long-held vow of silence concerning Clara was replaced by an active, courageous protection,
Her fear of social judgment was replaced by the peace of honest love. Charlotte took a moment to look through the clear, unadorned window. The sun was cold but bright. The Magi traveled a long, difficult path, not following a comfortable highway, but a single, strange star, she reflected. They sought a king, but found a humble truth. Charlotte realized that the star she had followed was not society's expectation, but the quiet, persistent moral voice that had compelled her to find Clara and to support Eleanor's true love. The dawning of new understanding was that true wealth lies in the integrity of the family unit, not its facade. Elias's gift of gold, the practical resolution. Elias Ashworth sat in his study, contemplating his new career path. He had accepted Sir Alistair Finch's offer, a smaller, less prestigious position, but one that granted him independence and the moral leverage he required. He was fulfilling the symbolic act of the Magi's gift of gold. Gold traditionally represents kingship, but for Elias, it now represented the practical foundation necessary for his family's new beginning. Elias called Richard Thorne into his study. He did not speak of the scandal or the reduced circumstances. Instead, he spoke of Richard's architectural skill. "Mr. Thorne," Elias began, sliding a new contract across the desk, "the reckoning has reduced my means, but not my belief in talent. I have retained you to design and oversee the renovation of my small subsidiary office. The budget is modest, but the design must be innovative. This is your first official commission in Bath." This was Elias's final practical act of faith. By entrusting Richard with his professional future, Elias was not merely accepting his son-in-law, he was actively investing in his chosen path. He was giving the gift of gold, the means to build an honest life, to the man he once deemed a pauper. Samuel's gift of frankincense, the spiritual resolution. Samuel, Neptune, was packed and ready for the early afternoon coach to Bristol. He was saying a quiet farewell to his parents. His gift to the family was frankincense, symbolizing his new spiritual devotion to his true calling. He presented his father with a final, magnificent drawing, not of a full ship, but of the keel, the central spine of the vessel. "Papa," Samuel said, his voice imbued with a newfound maturity, "this is the design for my first project. The keel must be straight, deep, and true. It is the foundation that allows the ship to brave any storm. You have given me my keel, Papa. You gave me the courage to be true." Elias, deeply moved, recognized the profound significance. The boy had chosen a life dedicated to integrity and strength, the very principles Elias had chosen over wealth. Elias realized his life's work would continue, not in the dusty courtroom, but in the solid, honest structure of his son's ships. "Go well, my builder," Elias said, embracing his son, his heart full of pride. "We shall watch for the reports of your progress." Thomas's gift of myrrh, the sacrificial resolution. Thomas, King Arthur, having performed his tiny, vital acts of sacrifice, the soup and the ship, was left with the final quiet sadness of his brother's departure. His gift was myrrh, the ancient symbol of suffering and eventual comfort. As Samuel left, Thomas walked to the cold hearth where the ashes of the great Christmas fire lay. He gently placed his hands over the ashes, performing a final private ritual. He was now the protector of the hearth. His childhood vow to save the world had matured into the serious, selfless responsibility of preserving the family's emotional warmth and memory. He had learned that the greatest heroes aren't the ones who fight dragons, but the ones who offer quiet, consistent love. His new understanding was that sacrifice is a continuous, internal act. Eleanor's revelation, the guiding star. Eleanor and Richard stood on the doorstep, watching the last of the greenery being cleared from the path.
They were leaving for London for a week, celebrating their engagement before Richard began his work. "We have reached the end of the road, haven't we?" Eleanor mused. "No more Cake King, no more masks, just reality." Richard, ever the pragmatist, pointed towards the sky, now visible through the clearing clouds. "Look, Eleanor, it is not just reality, it is certainty," he said. In the late afternoon sky, one star shone with a clarity that seemed impossible, bright, steady, and dominant. "The star's guidance," Richard whispered. "The Magi followed it through the wilderness, guided by the promise of truth. We too followed a path that seemed dark and impossible, guided only by our inner vows. The star isn't something out there, it is the truth we carry within. It led us here, to this simple, honest beginning." Eleanor looked at the star, then at the modest figure of Richard beside her. She realized the full spiritual significance of the journey. They had passed through the wilderness of convention, survived the reckoning of consequences, and arrived at the new beginning, a life built on the bedrock of their honest choices. The journey of the 12 days of wonder was over. The Ashworths had fulfilled their spiritual commitment, choosing integrity over ease, love over contract, and truth over reputation. They had accepted the guidance of the star, the light of their own conscience, and were ready to step forward, stripped of their past burdens, into the hard, bright light of 1889.
The quiet, poignant closing of the Christmastide season. The decorations are stored, and the community returns to normal, fundamentally changed by the 12 days. The moment the Epiphany sunlight faded on January 6th, the quiet, poignant work of the putting away began. This ritual, mandated by tradition and superstition, keeping decorations up beyond Epiphany was deemed unlucky, was the final act of the Christmastide season. It was a tangible, melancholy process where the house was stripped of its magic, forcing the family to confront the permanent changes wrought by the preceding 12 days. The Ashworth home, no longer a sanctuary for secrets or a stage for defiance, reverted to its former status as a solid, respectable residence. But the people within its walls were irrevocably altered. The funeral of the tree. The most significant task was the dismantling of the Christmas tree. Elias and Charlotte supervised the effort in the quiet parlor, a room now strangely large and echoing. They started with the lights, the dozen white candles clipped to the branches. Charlotte extinguished each one carefully, the faint scent of spent wick marking the end of the glow. "It feels like a funeral," Charlotte confessed, gently wrapping the fragile glass ornaments in tissue paper. "It is," Elias agreed, lifting the heavy base of the tree. "The death of the illusion. This tree symbolized the life we wished for, perfect, bright, and untouched. The life we have now chosen is messier, but real." As they carried the denuded tree out to the garden for burning, Elias paused. He looked back at the hearth, where the fire was being deliberately banked low, ready to return to its practical role as a heat source, not a dramatic centerpiece. "I have lost the client, but I have found the man," Elias thought. The burden of his lost career was already easing, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of his professional integrity. He was no longer Elias Ashworth, high-flying solicitor to the elite, but Elias Ashworth, a man who had chosen mercy over gold. This new normalcy, while financially modest, felt like a return to an authentic self. Samuel's departure and the empty space. The quiet work was briefly interrupted by Samuel's imminent departure for Bristol. He stood in the hall, his trunk packed with the few clothes he needed and his precious sketchbook.
He carried the small wooden ship carving, Thomas's gift, in his breast pocket. The departure was not tearful, but marked by a profound mutual respect. Samuel, the former ghost of the house, was leaving as a man with a purpose. "The hearth will be waiting," Charlotte said, embracing him. "But go now and build true." Elias shook his son's hand, a firm, equal grip. "The sea demands honesty, Samuel. Give it nothing less." As the cab pulled away, leaving a smear of cold exhaust on the frosty street, an empty space was created in the Ashworth family. It was the space of expectation, the space Samuel had been forced to fill. That space was now occupied by freedom. Elias and Charlotte looked at the front door, realizing that their control over their children's lives was gone, replaced by trust. The normal routine of the house would be permanently recalibrated around this absence. The final ribbons of Eleanor. The removal of the last ribbons and festive clutter was left to Eleanor. She found a stray piece of crimson ribbon, the same ribbon she had used to adorn the tree on Christmas morning, lying beneath the drawing-room sofa. It reminded her of the intense, anxious days when her future hung in the balance between Arthur Davies and Richard Thorne. She walked to her room and found the simple, unadorned architect mask Richard had worn at the mask. She placed the crimson ribbon inside it, symbolizing the passion that had won against the propriety of society. Eleanor was preparing to leave Bath for London with Richard the following day. Her return to normalcy was the most drastic, leaving her life of comfort for a life of shared, demanding labor in Bristol. The greatest change is not in the house, but in the definition of a marriage, she mused. Her new normal would be one of true partnership, built on effort and shared vision, not on inherited wealth. She looked forward not to balls and social calls, but to the small rented cottage that represented her freedom. The community might whisper, but their judgment no longer held any power over her. The true beauty of the season, she realized, was found in the willingness to shed the illusions of luxury. Thomas and the quiet of the hearth. The deepest sense of the putting away rested with Thomas. He was now alone in the parlor, the official keeper of the residual feeling of the season. He carefully swept the pine needles from the floor. Each needle was a tiny, fragrant memory of the 12 days, the joy of Christmas morning, the cold reality of Boxing Day, the fear of the reckoning, and the chaos of the mask. He knelt by the hearth, now dark and cool. He took the tiny pile of ashes, the remnants of the Christmas fire, and placed them in a small, sealed tin. He placed the tin on the highest shelf of the mantelpiece, above where the stockings had hung. This was his sacred act of preservation. The tin contained the memory of the warmth they had found during the deepest winter. He knew that the decorations would reappear next year, but the family that put them up would be fundamentally different. He had learned that the external world, the cold, the poverty, the social demands, was always waiting, but that the hearth could be kept safe not by hiding, but by the strength of the love within. His new normalcy was a quiet, profound maturity, the assumption of his role as the empathetic center of the family. The return to normal. By the morning of January 7th, the house looked utterly bare, clean, and ready for the new year. The Ashworths gathered for a simple, unhurried breakfast. Elias was already preparing to go to his smaller office, his step lighter than it had been in years. Charlotte had dispatched a final, reassuring letter to Clara. Eleanor and Richard were finalizing travel plans. They sat at the table, sharing a quiet, unmasked peace. They had returned to normal, yet the return was a new beginning. They had been exposed to the full spectrum of human experience, from poverty and fear to reckless passion and moral courage. The community would return to normal as well, but the whispers would remain. The Ashworths were no longer the symbol of rigid, predictable success, but the living proof that true Christmastide magic lies in the courage to seek and live the truth, no matter the cost. They had been fundamentally changed by the 12 days of wonder, emerging stronger, poorer, and infinitely more whole. Exploring the clandestine letters exchanged between Eleanor and Richard Thorne, detailing the plans for their confrontation with Elias and the emotional strain of their hidden relationship. The late afternoon of New Year's Eve, December 31st, was a flurry of final, frantic preparation within the Ashworth home. But while the servants polished silver and Charlotte fretted over the dinner service, Eleanor Ashworth was engaged in the riskiest maneuver of her secret courtship, securing the final correspondence from Richard Thorne. Since her daring confrontation with him during the Mummers play, Eleanor and Richard had communicated through a single trusted intermediary, Mr. Ponsonby, the kindly printer, whom Elias, in his act of moral mercy, had kept close. Ponsonby, who admired the young couple's passion, had agreed to act as their messenger, carrying small folded notes disguised as printing orders. The arrangement was perilous, the risk of one of the notes falling into the hands of Aunt Honoria, or worse, Elias, was immense. The notes detailed not flowery romantic sentiments, but a cold, hard strategy, the precise conditions under which Richard would challenge Elias for Eleanor's hand.
The last delivery. At 4 p.m., the carriage carrying the final boxes of champagne for the evening arrived. Tucked into the delivery man's basket, concealed beneath a velvet cloth, was a small, tightly rolled scroll of parchment, Richard's final, critical note. Eleanor was waiting in the hallway, pretending to supervise the placement of the floral arrangements. The moment the delivery man left, she snatched the scroll, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She retreated immediately to the cold safety of her bedroom. Unrolling the scroll, she saw Richard's precise architectural hand, the ink still faintly damp. The note itself was a masterpiece of coded language, designed to look like a draft for a public notice should it be intercepted. To the warden of the structure. Proposed alteration of foundation, the engagement. My survey is complete. I was delayed, client in Bristol, December 30th, but am now prepared to present the final plans. The opposition, AD, will present a contract, the ring, at midnight. The warden will expect the foundation to remain passive. Our success hinges on two elements. One, the counter-offer, the vow. I will present my plan at 11:59 p.m. I will state my honest means and my true intention, which is partnership, not possession. 2. The consent of the foundation, your choice. You must be prepared to publicly and instantly reject the opposition's contract. The warden's anger will be immense, but our structure will hold only if your rejection is immediate and absolute. We must risk the temporary collapse of the site for the sake of the permanent, true building. The emotional strain. Eleanor read the note twice, the cool logic of Richard's plan doing little to calm the tremor in her heart. The emotional strain of the hidden relationship had peaked. For weeks she had lived a double life, the dutiful daughter preparing for a respectable engagement by day, and the co-conspirator plotting a social catastrophe by night. The note's final point, the consent of the foundation, was the most terrifying. Richard was asking her to perform an act of public defiance that would shatter her father's trust and expose her family to the most intense ridicule. The loss of her mother's approval, even temporarily, was a paralyzing prospect.
She walked to her small writing desk and took up her pen, needing to write a final confirming message, though she knew it was too late to send it through Ponsonby. It was a letter only for herself, a way to solidify her wavering resolve. My dearest architect, I have received your final instructions. You ask for a truth so absolute it feels like violence. I have rehearsed the words 100 times, but the thought of my father's face, stripped of his professional calm, fills me with dread. I understand that the structure cannot be built on a lie. I understand that if I accept Arthur's contract, the foundations will be cracked forever. I will be ready. I will meet your gaze at 11:59 p.m. I will choose passion over propriety, and you will know my answer is yes before the clock strikes. May the new year begin with a truth so loud no one can ignore it. She folded the letter, not to send it, but to hide it in the deepest recess of her jewelry box, a private vow, a promise to herself that she would not falter. Elias's final preparations. While Eleanor secured her emotional vow, Elias Ashworth sat in his study, making his own preparations. He had already lost Sir Alistair Finch that morning, fulfilling his vow of professional mercy. Now he faced the final dreaded duty, ushering in the match with Arthur Davies, the last stabilizing element in his collapsing life. Elias was tired, his confidence deeply shaken by the morning's confrontation with Finch. He opened his personal ledger, a record of all his financial risks and victories. He saw the cold, hard column of figures representing the annual retainer from Finch, now replaced by a chilling 0. He had promised Arthur Davies that the proposal would proceed seamlessly. He had arranged for the orchestra to play a specific waltz just before midnight, signaling Arthur's moment. Elias did not love Arthur Davies, but he loved the security Arthur represented, a fortress against the financial and social ruin that now threatened his house. Elias felt the terrible weight of his duty. He had to ensure his daughter was safe, even if it meant sacrificing her happiness. His preparations were driven by the vow to protect his family's standing. He wrote a short note to Arthur, confirming the precise timing of the midnight proposal and the expectation of discretion. It was a cold, formal contract, a final attempt to control the unpredictable currents of life. The mirror of Thomas and Samuel. The tension affected the younger boys as well. Thomas, King Arthur, was trying on his costume for the evening, a ridiculous gold-painted doublet, but his movements were jerky, his usual joy absent. He found Samuel in the hall, staring out the window at the growing crowd of carriages arriving for the party. "I hate all the secrets, Sam," Thomas confessed, tying his doublet strings. "I hate how everyone is pretending today. Papa is pretending he isn't cross about his office. Elle is pretending she likes Mr. Davies. It is all a terrible lie before the new year." Samuel, who lived under the immense weight of his own secret vocational dream, understood. The new year demands honesty, Thomas. The Chinese New Year is about cleansing the house of the old spirits. We need to cleanse our souls of the lies. Samuel, knowing he had to leave the house, but still fearing his father's anger, made his own quiet vow. He went to his room, retrieved his detailed sketch of the schooner, and placed it prominently on Elias's desk, directly beside the ledger of lost income. He would let the drawing speak the truth for him, fulfilling his vow to choose identity over expectation, allowing the inevitable reckoning to fall where it may. The final hour. As the first carriage of guests arrived, Eleanor descended the staircase, the secret note burning a hole in her imagination. She met her mother's eye, Charlotte, serene and oblivious to the dramatic confrontation minutes away. She felt a surge of love for her family and a terrifying sense of isolation. She was about to be the disruptive force in their carefully constructed world. She saw Richard enter the hall, rough coat exchanged for evening attire,
his eyes finding hers instantly. He held a simple, earnest gaze that told her, "I am here. The plans are set. Do not falter." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. She was ready to deliver the required consent of the foundation. She had spent her Christmastide journey learning the high price of truth, and she was prepared to pay it all for the sake of an honest future. The clock on the hall table ticked relentlessly toward midnight, toward the terrifying, exhilarating climax of her secret correspondence. Detailing Charlotte's practical, meticulous efforts to secure funds, documentation, and safe passage for her sister, Clara, ensuring her anonymity and long-term security abroad. The small hours of January 6th, Epiphany Day, were the last window of opportunity for Charlotte Ashworth to fulfill her vow of protection toward her sister, Clara. The drama of the mask was over. The family's secrets were revealed to one another, and the inevitable social reckoning was underway. Yet Charlotte's duty was not complete until Clara was safely out of Bath, out of England, and equipped to build a new life free from the suffocating judgment of the past. While the rest of the household slept off the revelry, Charlotte was in Elias's study, the gas lamp turned low, engaged in a silent, meticulous operation. She was not a solicitor, but she possessed an organizational rigor that few lawyers could match. The cost of sanctuary. Charlotte's first task was financial, securing the penny for the crossing. She needed enough capital to establish Clara abroad and enough for the immediate, discreet travel. She did not touch Elias's assets. Her husband had already sacrificed his career for his conscience. She would not ask him to finance a potentially ruinous familial secret as well. Instead, she drew only on her own personal income, inherited from her aunt, which she had meticulously saved over years for household contingencies. She counted the sovereigns, her lips moving silently. She sold 2 small, valuable pieces of inherited jewelry, a diamond brooch and a cameo, to a discreet broker she had contacted through a trusted charity contact. She requested payment in foreign currency, French francs and American dollars, to ensure Clara's financial ease upon arrival. The act of selling the jewelry was profoundly symbolic. These were the trappings of the Victorian respectability she had clung to for so long. By converting them into currency for Clara's escape, Charlotte was trading the symbols of her old life for the foundation of her sister's new life. The sacrifice was physical, tangible, and necessary.
The forging of a new identity. The most challenging task was securing the necessary documentation for Clara's anonymity and long-term security. Clara had fled England years ago using a false name and no proper passport, leaving her vulnerable. Charlotte had reached out to the same trusted contact who had connected her to the jewelry broker, a humanitarian named Mrs. Elmsworth, who worked discreetly with women escaping difficult circumstances. Mrs. Elmsworth had procured a genuine but difficult-to-trace set of papers. Clara would travel as Mrs. Eleanor Clark, a nod to the Mummers Clark alias, chosen for familiarity, a widow seeking a fresh start abroad. The documents gave her a new birth certificate, a marriage license proving widowhood, and a modest reference for a governess position in a town near Le Havre, France. Charlotte spent 2 hours writing out a meticulous, personalized instruction manual for Clara. 1. Financial protocol, how to discreetly bank the foreign currency. 2. Social protocol, how to introduce herself as a widow, referencing a vague, respectable, and untraceable past in the north of England. 3. Legal protocol, the exact process for renewing her residency permit in France in 6 months. This documentation was Charlotte's final, desperate attempt to create a secure, stable reality for her impulsive sister. It was an act of maternal diligence, ensuring that Clara's inherent dramatic tendency would not lead her back to ruin. The final letter of absolution. Once the money and papers were secured, Charlotte wrote her final personal letter to Clara, the one piece of correspondence that had nothing to do with finance or logistics, but everything to do with absolution. She placed the letter inside a small, sealed envelope tucked into the passport folder. My dearest Clara, my little traveler, this journey is not an escape from shame. It is a pilgrimage toward your true self. The price of the past has been paid, not by your flight, but by my silence. I have sinned by prioritizing my own comfort and the world's judgment over your pain. For this, I ask your forgiveness. The money and the documents are simply tools. The true wealth I give you is the belief that you are worthy of a second beginning. Do not fear the world, Clara. Go and live a life so honest and so full of purpose that the whispers of the past simply cease to matter. Your courage in returning to Bath, even in disguise, has taught me more than any sermon. Remember the candle in the window. It will always be lit for you. We are family, always. With eternal love, Charlotte. The Midnight Rendezvous. At 3 a.m., Charlotte put on her thickest cloak and, carrying the small, heavy valise containing the money and documents, descended the staircase. She met the same trusted jester, Clara's friend, Mr. Elmsworth's associate, who had spoken to her at the Mask. The meeting took place not in the parlor, but at the foot of the garden path, near where the last vestiges of the Christmas tree lay waiting to be burned. "The coach leaves for the coast at 4, the jester whispered, taking the valise. "The documents are clear, the money is secured. She is waiting in a private inn, ready." Charlotte felt a surge of cold dread as she handed over the precious package, the culmination of weeks of secret work and years of suppressed guilt. Tell her she must not write for a year. Tell her she must be Mrs. Clark, the respectable widow, and she must be nothing else. "I will tell her, madam," the jester replied, placing a respectful hand on Charlotte's arm. "But she already knows. She saw the cost of dishonesty in her own life. She seeks the truth now. She seeks to be worthy of your sacrifice." With a swift, silent movement, the jester vanished into the pre-dawn fog, the valise and Clara's future with him. Charlotte stood alone, shivering, but felt a deep, profound sense of release. Her duty was done. She had paid the price, the penny for the crossing, and secured her sister's freedom. As the faintest streaks of pale pink light began to appear on the eastern horizon, marking the dawn of the final decisive day, Charlotte walked back into the house. She paused at the clear glass window, its view unadorned by holly or ivy. She saw only the cold street and the immense, quiet certainty of the coming day. The secret was gone. The money was spent. The shame was lifted. Charlotte was now free to face the consequences of the new, honest life she and Elias had chosen. She was ready for the epiphany light to fall on her unmasked face. This is a wonderful opportunity to deepen Samuel's character arc, which is central to the theme of choosing identity over expectation. This section will chronologically follow The Gathering of the Kin, Section 6, and occur on the evening of December 29th, focusing intensely on his internal world before the New Year's confrontation. Here is the story draft for the 17th section, The Shipwright's Dream, approximately 3,500 words as requested. A close focus on Samuel's internal struggle and his intense, secret hours spent drafting his ship designs, showcasing his dedication and the conflict between his love for engineering and his fear of disappointing his father. The house was quiet, humming with the satisfied buzz of a successful social evening. December 29th had ended, the guests from the Gathering of the Kin having departed, leaving behind the comforting scent of wood smoke and expensive port. But for Samuel Ashworth, 14 years old and trapped between the heavy expectations of his father and the siren call of his own heart, sleep was impossible. He retreated to the cold, small box room at the top of the house, usually reserved for storing out-of-season drapery. This room was his sanctuary. Here, under the weak, solitary light of a smuggled oil lamp, he kept the true testament of his soul,
his shipwright's sketchbook. The contrast of two worlds. Samuel sat on an upturned crate, his breath misting in the frigid air. The contrast between the two worlds he inhabited was never starker. Downstairs, his father, Elias, sat calculating the profits and losses of the law, a profession built on the certainty of contracts and precedent. Upstairs, Samuel was charting the unpredictable forces of wind, tide, and wood. Elias saw a future for Samuel in the study of Blackstone and Coke. Samuel saw a future built on the principles of buoyancy and sheer strength. He opened his sketchbook, the pages worn and soft from constant handling. He did not doodle, he engineered. His drawings were not mere sketches, but precise mathematical renderings. Page 42, a detailed cross-section of a three-masted schooner, the Patience, a name he chose because patience was exactly what his dream required. Every line, from the sharp angle of the hull to the complexity of the rigging, was measured. He had spent hours calculating the drag coefficients, ensuring the design maximized speed and stability. Page 68, a careful study of the compound curvature required for the ship's bow. He used geometry and trigonometry, struggling through complex equations Elias never knew he was capable of handling. He felt a deep, profound peace when he worked here. The wood grain in his mind was far more real than the embossed leather of his father's legal textbooks. Here, he was not the awkward, quiet middle son. He was a master builder, a creator of structures that could defy the ocean. The conflict, love versus fear. His current project was the most ambitious yet, the design for a fishing trawler capable of navigating the rough waters of the Bristol Channel, a direct, tangible solution to the problems faced by the coastal communities he and his family had recently visited on St. Stephen's Day. He had started the design with clinical precision, but tonight his emotions bled onto the page. He drew the trawler with powerful protective curves, a vessel designed to bring men safely home. As he worked, he heard the faint echo of his father's voice in his mind, not harsh, but weighted with disappointment. The law is the backbone of society, Samuel. Architecture, engineering, they are skilled trades, yes, but the law is the power. And the memory of his mother's gentle expectation added to the pressure. Your father hopes you will carry on his legacy, dear. It is a good, honorable future. The conflict was agonizing. His love for engineering was not a childish fancy. It was a deeply ingrained necessity, a core part of his identity. Yet his love for his father translated into a crippling fear of causing him pain. He traced the outline of the trawler's hull, the curve feeling like the immense weight resting on his own chest. His vow to tell his father the truth felt impossible in the wake of Elias's professional anxieties. He was convinced that revealing his dream now would be an act of selfishness, compounding his father's recent troubles.
The mentor's influence. A memory from the gathering of the kin provided a brief surge of courage. His conversation with Richard Thorne. Richard, the architect, had spoken to him not as a child, but as an intellectual equal. Samuel paused his drafting and retrieved a small folded note from his pocket, a sketch Richard had drawn for him during their conversation, illustrating the principle of shear load in a triangular mast stay. Richard's confidence in his own unconventional career, despite his modest means, was a beacon. Richard had told him, "If the numbers are true, Samuel, the structure will stand no matter what the critics say. Trust your figures more than their opinions." This affirmation from an outside source was the strength Samuel needed. His figures were true. He had spent years ensuring the mathematical integrity of his dream. He picked up a charcoal pencil and, in a sudden, decisive act, he drew a small personal symbol onto the corner of the trawler's plan, the North Star, the symbol of fixed guidance and unwavering destination. The strategic error.
As the hour passed 1 a.m., the cold was unbearable, but Samuel knew he could not stop. He was working toward the impending New Year's Eve climax. He realized the immense strategic difficulty of his vow. He couldn't just tell his father, he had to show him. His future had to be presented with the same detailed, undeniable authority as a legal brief. He worked on the final presentation page. Proposal for apprenticeship, Bristol Shipyards, 1889. He meticulously listed the required courses, the cost, the time commitment, and the potential career trajectory, contrasting it with the established legal path. He needed to make his passion logical, a calculation Elias could understand and respect. He folded the drawing of the trawler, tucking it inside the presentation folder. He intended to leave the folder for Elias to find on the 31st, a silent deposition of his true intentions. In his exhaustion and haste, however, he made a crucial symbolic error. Instead of placing the folder on his father's professional solicitor's desk, he placed it, still half tucked into his legal textbook, onto the wrong desk. He crept downstairs and, thinking he had delivered his full case, placed the folder directly on the large, imposing mahogany desk in Elias's study. He failed to notice in his fatigue that the desk was not his father's professional solicitor's desk, but the family's correspondence desk, the one used by both Elias and Charlotte, and the very one where Elias was now arranging the New Year's contracts. Samuel's private meeting with Mr. Ponsonby, the printer, before the New Year's Eve party, where Elias explains his professional dilemma, and the two men find a shared, painful understanding of the law's limitations. The chill of December 30th had settled deep into the bones of Bath. In the Ashworth home, the atmosphere was fraught with unspoken anxiety, as Elias prepared for the decisive meeting with Sir Alister Finch the following morning, the meeting that would determine both Mr. Ponsonby's ruin and Elias's professional future. But Elias could not face Finch without first facing the man whose life hung in the balance. In a move highly irregular for a solicitor of his standing, Elias had arranged a private, clandestine meeting with Mr. Herbert Ponsonby, the indebted printer, on the very edge of the ruined district where the Ashworths had done their charity work. The rendezvous. The meeting place was a desolate corner near the old abandoned wool mills, a spot where the heavy stone walls blocked the light and amplified the cold wind. Ponsonby had been waiting, a quiet, stoic figure wrapped in a threadbare coat. He was no longer the desperate man Elias had seen peering through his shop window. He was simply weary, his dignity intact despite his destitution. Elias arrived on foot, dismissing his carriage a block away to ensure secrecy. He did not wear his solicitor's usual polished boots, choosing instead a pair of rough, practical shoes. The legal world was not welcome here. "Mr. Ponsonby," Elias said, extending his hand. The contact was awkward, weighted with the formality that their respective positions, creditor's agent and debtor, demanded, yet softened by the human recognition from St. Stephen's Day. "Mr. Ashworth," Ponsonby replied, his voice flat, "I assume you did not bring me here in this cold to serve the final notice personally. I appreciate that, at least." "I came here to speak to the man, not the contract," Elias admitted, pulling his muffler tighter. "I came here to offer an explanation, though the law requires none." The law's limitations. Elias did not offer Ponsonby false hope. He laid bare the cold reality of the situation, speaking not as an agent, but as a student of the law grappling with its moral failings. "The legal position is airtight, Ponsonby. Sir Alister Finch holds the primary debenture, and your solvency lapsed on the 1st of the month. I have spent a week searching for a loophole, a delay, a technicality that would allow us to proceed with a restructure, but Finch's contracts are mercilessly precise." He paused, looking at the skeletal outline of the abandoned wool mill, a true ghost of the mill that symbolized the destructive power of industrial finance. "The law, Ponsonby, is a double-edged sword. It is designed to protect the contract, the agreement between men, but it is blind to the spirit, the effort, the years of honest labor, the worth of the man himself. In this case, the law is just, but it is not righteous." Ponsonby listened, his gaze fixed on the broken cobblestones. He was not angry, but profoundly resigned. "Mr. Ashworth," Ponsonby said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I understand the law better than most. I printed thousands of contracts in my day. I know that ink is stronger than iron. I know you serve a master whose only god is the balance sheet. I hold no malice towards you." This lack of malice struck Elias to the core. Ponsonby's acceptance of his fate, while tragic, was imbued with a quiet moral authority that mocked Elias's own gilded cage. Ponsonby had lost his money, but retained his soul. Elias had retained his wealth, but felt his soul slipping away. The shared, painful understanding. The conversation shifted from legal fact to shared, painful understanding, the understanding of men trapped by their own commitments. "My own firm was built on the back of Finch's business," Elias confessed, speaking the words out loud for the first time. "If I fail to execute this foreclosure, I will lose him. I will lose a fortune, and I risk damaging my reputation beyond repair."
The mentor's influence. A memory from the gathering of the kin provided a brief surge of courage: his conversation with Richard Thorne. Richard, the architect, had spoken to him not as a child, but as an intellectual equal. Samuel paused his drafting and retrieved a small folded note from his pocket, a sketch Richard had drawn for him during their conversation, illustrating the principle of shear load in a triangular mast stay. Richard's confidence in his own unconventional career, despite his modest means, was a beacon. Richard had told him, "If the numbers are true, Samuel, the structure will stand no matter what the critics say. Trust your figures more than their opinions." This affirmation from an outside source was the strength Samuel needed. His figures were true. He had spent years ensuring the mathematical integrity of his dream. He picked up a charcoal pencil, and in a sudden, decisive act, he drew a small personal symbol onto the corner of the trawler's plan: the North Star, the symbol of fixed guidance and unwavering destination. The strategic error. As the hour passed 1 a.m., the cold was unbearable, but Samuel knew he could not stop. He was working toward the impending New Year's Eve climax. He realized the immense strategic difficulty of his vow. He couldn't just tell his father, he had to show him. His future had to be presented with the same detailed, undeniable authority as a legal brief. He worked on the final presentation page: Proposal for Apprenticeship, Bristol Shipyards, 1889. He meticulously listed the required courses, the cost, the time commitment, and the potential career trajectory, contrasting it with the established legal path. He needed to make his passion logical, a calculation Elias could understand and respect. He folded the drawing of the trawler, tucking it inside the presentation folder. He intended to leave the folder for Elias to find on the 31st, a silent deposition of his true intentions. In his exhaustion and haste, however, he made a crucial symbolic error.
Instead of placing the folder on his father's professional solicitor's desk, he placed it, still half tucked into his legal textbook, onto the wrong desk. He crept downstairs and, thinking he had delivered his full case, placed the folder directly on the large, imposing mahogany desk in Elias's study. He failed to notice in his fatigue that the desk was not his father's professional solicitor's desk, but the family's correspondence desk, the one used by both Elias and Charlotte, and the very one where Elias was now arranging the New Year's contracts. Samuel's private meeting with Mr. Ponsonby, the printer, before the New Year's Eve party, where Elias explains his professional dilemma, and the two men find a shared, painful understanding of the law's limitations. The chill of December 30th had settled deep into the bones of Bath. In the Ashworth home, the atmosphere was fraught with unspoken anxiety, as Elias prepared for the decisive meeting with Sir Alister Finch the following morning, the meeting that would determine both Mr. Ponsonby's ruin and Elias's professional future. But Elias could not face Finch without first facing the man whose life hung in the balance. In a move highly irregular for a solicitor of his standing, Elias had arranged a private, clandestine meeting with Mr. Herbert Ponsonby, the indebted printer, on the very edge of the ruined district where the Ashworths had done their charity work. The rendezvous. The meeting place was a desolate corner near the old abandoned wool mills, a spot where the heavy stone walls blocked the light and amplified the cold wind. Ponsonby had been waiting, a quiet, stoic figure wrapped in a threadbare coat. He was no longer the desperate man Elias had seen peering through his shop window. He was simply weary, his dignity intact despite his destitution. Elias arrived on foot, dismissing his carriage a block away to ensure secrecy. He did not wear his solicitor's usual polished boots, choosing instead a pair of rough, practical shoes. The legal world was not welcome here. "Mr. Ponsonby," Elias said, extending his hand. The contact was awkward, weighted with the formality that their respective positions, creditor's agent and debtor, demanded, yet softened by the human recognition from St. Stephen's Day. "Mr. Ashworth," Ponsonby replied, his voice flat, "I assume you did not bring me here in this cold to serve the final notice personally. I appreciate that, at least." "I came here to speak to the man, not the contract," Elias admitted, pulling his muffler tighter. "I came here to offer an explanation, though the law requires none." The law's limitations. Elias did not offer Ponsonby false hope. He laid bare the cold reality of the situation, speaking not as an agent, but as a student of the law grappling with its moral failings. "The legal position is airtight, Ponsonby. Sir Alister Finch holds the primary debenture, and your solvency lapsed on the 1st of the month. I have spent a week searching for a loophole, a delay, a technicality that would allow us to proceed with a restructure, but Finch's contracts are mercilessly precise." He paused, looking at the skeletal outline of the abandoned wool mill, a true ghost of the mill that symbolized the destructive power of industrial finance. "The law, Ponsonby, is a double-edged sword. It is designed to protect the contract, the agreement between men, but it is blind to the spirit, the effort, the years of honest labor, the worth of the man himself. In this case, the law is just, but it is not righteous." Ponsonby listened, his gaze fixed on the broken cobblestones. He was not angry, but profoundly resigned. "Mr. Ashworth," Ponsonby said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I understand the law better than most. I printed thousands of contracts in my day. I know that ink is stronger than iron. I know you serve a master whose only god is the balance sheet. I hold no malice towards you." This lack of malice struck Elias to the core. Ponsonby's acceptance of his fate, while tragic, was imbued with a quiet moral authority that mocked Elias's own gilded cage. Ponsonby had lost his money, but retained his soul. Elias had retained his wealth, but felt his soul slipping away. The shared, painful understanding. The conversation shifted from legal fact to shared, painful understanding, the understanding of men trapped by their own commitments. My own firm was built on the back of Finch's business, Elias confessed, speaking the words out loud for the first time. If I fail to execute this foreclosure, I will lose him. I will lose a fortune, and I risk damaging my reputation beyond repair.